Hey everybody, this is Sleepy Crime, and today I'm gonna help you. I know you want to fall asleep to this video, so before you do, put a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. By the way, where are you from and what time are you watching? Make yourself comfortable and relax. Megan Taylor Meyer was born on November the 6th, 1992, in the suburban community of O'Fallon, Missouri. Raised by her parents, Tina and Ron Meyer, Megan was known for her vivacious spirit and strong sense of empathy. From an early age, she exhibited a creative streak and a natural inclination towards social interaction. However, beneath her energetic exterior lay deep-seated personal struggles. Megan was diagnosed with attention deficit disorder and depression during early childhood. These conditions made her academic and social life more complex. To help her navigate these challenges, she began therapy in the 3rd grade. Megan's parents were actively involved in her mental health treatment, ensuring she received the care and attention needed to manage her conditions. A significant factor contributing to Megan's emotional turbulence was her struggle with body image. Overweight during much of her childhood, she often felt insecure and faced ridicule from her peers. These experiences of bullying began in elementary school and intensified as she grew older, compounding her feelings of isolation and self-doubt. Despite these challenges, Megan maintained an outwardly cheerful demeanor and worked hard to forge friendships and participate in group activities. At home, Megan found solace in her family. Her bond with her mother was particularly strong. Tina Meyer became Megan's confidant, frequently discussing the issues her daughter faced and striving to bolster her self-esteem. Megan's parents took care to monitor her mental health, adjusting medications and attending therapy sessions regularly. Her upbringing was marked by love and vigilance, underscoring the seriousness with which her family addressed her vulnerabilities. Megan was a girl of diverse interests. She enjoyed writing, spending time with animals, and participating in school sports, particularly volleyball. Her interests offered moments of joy and distraction from the more difficult aspects of her life. These activities also served as a way for her to connect with her peers, giving her a sense of inclusion that was otherwise often elusive. The early years of Megan's life paint the picture of a young girl grappling with complex emotional challenges, but surrounded by a family determined to support her. This foundation of care and struggle would shape the context of the events that would follow in her teenage years. As Megan entered 8th grade in the fall of 2006, she made a significant change in her academic environment. Her parents enrolled her at Immaculate Conception Catholic School in Dardenne Prairie, Missouri. This decision was driven by concerns over persistent bullying at her previous public school. The family hoped the new setting would offer a more nurturing atmosphere and a fresh start. Immaculate Conception was a small private school offering a tighter-knit student community. Megan saw the move as an opportunity to reinvent herself and leave behind some of the social difficulties that had plagued her. She quickly became involved in extracurricular activities, joining the school volleyball team, where she found an initial sense of camaraderie and belonging. Sports offered her a structured way to engage with peers and channel her energy. Despite these positive efforts, the transition was not without its challenges. Making new friends proved difficult at times, as the social circles in the smaller school were already well established. Megan occasionally struggled with feeling like an outsider. Nevertheless, she persisted, attending school events, participating in class, and trying to establish her place among her new classmates. At home, Megan continued to manage her depression and self-esteem issues. Her parents maintained their active role in her emotional health, keeping close tabs on her social experiences and academic progress. Tina Meyer, in particular, was deeply involved, often discussing Megan's school day, friendships, and feelings. Megan appeared to be making strides, showing signs of maturity and stability that gave her family hope. Part of Megan's adaptation strategy included a growing interest in online social interaction. Like many teens of her generation, she turned to the internet to explore friendships beyond her immediate environment. It was during this time that Megan created a profile on MySpace, a popular social networking site, with her mother's consent and under agreed-upon parental monitoring. The account allowed Megan to express herself and meet new people, while her parents attempted to balance freedom with safety. Megan's family believed the new school, combined with structured activities and responsible internet use, could help their daughter build confidence and improve her social life. Though the adjustment was not seamless, the early weeks of 8th grade suggested progress, a delicate balance of hope, vigilance, and resilience. This transition period marked a pivotal moment. Megan was seeking stability and identity in a new setting, supported by a family striving to guide her through adolescence. The changes in her environment and routines were attempts to move forward, a gesture toward a more promising chapter that, tragically, would soon be disrupted. As Megan settled into her new school and routines, her engagement with the digital world became a growing presence in her daily life. MySpace, a leading social networking platform at the time, offered an appealing way to connect, communicate, and craft a social identity. With her parents' cautious approval, Megan created a MySpace account under monitored conditions. She was excited by the possibility of making new friends beyond her immediate circle. Tina Meyer, aware of the potential dangers of online interaction, set rules for Megan's MySpace use. The account was only accessible from the family computer, located in the kitchen, and her parents had the login credentials. Messages and interactions were checked regularly. Megan understood these boundaries and, for a time, followed them diligently. In mid-September 2006, a new profile appeared in Megan's MySpace network. It belonged to Josh Evans, a boy who claimed to be 16 years old and living in a nearby town. His profile picture showed an attractive young male with a friendly expression. Megan, then 13, was immediately intrigued by the attention of an older boy who seemed interested in her. Their online interaction began with casual conversation and soon developed into daily exchanges. Josh told Megan he was homeschooled and didn't have a current MySpace profile photo because his mother had forbidden him from posting more pictures. Despite the limited visual and personal information, Megan felt a strong connection. She began to confide in him, sharing stories about school, her thoughts, and her feelings. His messages were supportive as kind, filled with compliments that made her feel appreciated and understood. As the online friendship grew, Megan's mood improved. Her family noticed that she seemed happier and more engaged. She would rush home from school to check her messages, eagerly anticipating Josh's replies. Tina, cautious but supportive, monitored the exchanges and allowed the correspondence to continue, as nothing in the messages seemed alarming at the time. Over several weeks, Megan and Josh exchanged hundreds of messages. He told her she was beautiful, funny, and that he liked her. For a young girl with a history of bullying and self-doubt, these affirmations were powerful. Megan believed she had found someone who saw her differently than the people who had hurt her in the past. She began to trust him deeply. The presence of Josh Evans in Megan's life marked a turning point. For the first time in months, she felt seen and validated by someone outside her immediate family. The online relationship gave her hope and excitement. Yet, behind the profile, the reality was far different than Megan imagined. By mid-October 2006, the tone of Megan's online relationship with Josh Evans began to change. The friendly and affectionate messages that had once uplifted her were replaced by increasingly distant and critical remarks. Megan, sensitive to shifts in tone, grew anxious and confused. She asked him repeatedly if something was wrong, but his responses grew colder, often evasive or dismissive. On October 15, 2006, the relationship took a devastating turn. That afternoon, Megan received a message from Josh that sharply criticized her character. He wrote that he had heard she was mean to her friends and accused her of being unkind. Megan, distressed and trying to defend herself, responded quickly. The conversation escalated, becoming more emotionally charged. Other MySpace users, some of whom Megan knew and others she didn't, suddenly joined in, sending her a flood of cruel messages. One message stood out. "Everybody in O'Fallon knows who you are. You're a bad person, and everybody hates you." Another came shortly after. "The world would be a better place without you." The barrage of attacks overwhelmed Megan. She responded in desperation, trying to understand what had gone wrong, pleading for explanations from Josh and others. That evening after dinner, Megan asked her mother if she could go upstairs to her room. Tina agreed, but reminded her to sign off from MySpace. Moments later, Tina checked the messages and saw the most recent exchange. Alarmed by the cruel content, she called upstairs to Megan, but there was no answer. Rushing to her daughter's room, Tina found Megan in her closet. Megan had hanged herself with a belt. Tina and Ron Meyer immediately called for emergency services and attempted to revive her. Megan was rushed to the hospital and placed on life support. The following day, October 16, 2006, she was pronounced dead just 3 weeks before her 14th birthday. The shock of Megan's sudden death devastated her family and community. In the immediate aftermath, there were no clear answers. To those closest to her, the turning point seemed to be the last string of cruel MySpace messages. Her parents began looking more closely into the online exchanges, desperate to understand what had happened and why. The tragedy was raw, and the emotional impact profound. In the days following her death, Megan's story began to circulate among friends and neighbors, prompting sorrow, outrage, and questions about how an online relationship could have gone so terribly wrong. In the days after Megan Meyer's death, grief swept through her family, school, and the town of Dardenne Prairie. Her parents, devastated and confused, began to search for answers in the messages that had preceded her suicide. What they discovered in the following weeks would shock them and the country. As they reviewed her MySpace account, the Meyers noticed inconsistencies in the Josh Evans profile. Tina Meyer reached out to the mother of a former neighborhood friend with whom Megan had previously fallen out. During the conversation, information surfaced suggesting that Josh had never existed. With mounting suspicions, the Meyers continued investigating and ultimately uncovered the truth. Josh Evans had been a fabrication. The account had been created by Lori Drew, a neighbor and the mother of a former friend of Megan's. Drew, along with her teenage daughter and a young employee who worked at her home, had orchestrated the deception. According to later statements, the motive behind the creation of the fake profile was to determine whether Megan was speaking ill of Drew's daughter. This revelation stunned Megan's parents. The person their daughter had trusted, and who had later turned on her so viciously, was not a teenage boy, but a group of people living just houses away. The betrayal was incomprehensible. Tina and Ron Meyer were not only mourning their daughter, but were now grappling with the knowledge that trusted neighbors had played a role in her death. News of the hoax spread quickly through the community. Public outrage followed. Residents were appalled by the manipulation and cruelty involved, particularly given that it was adults who had initiated and sustained the deception. The Drews faced intense scrutiny and condemnation from neighbors and the broader public. In response, the Meyer family became vocal about their experience. They began speaking publicly about Megan's story in an effort to raise awareness about cyberbullying and the dangers of online interactions. Tina Meyer, in particular, emerged as a forceful advocate for change, channeling her grief into efforts to protect other children from similar fates. The discovery of the hoax redefined the tragedy. What had initially appeared to be a personal, emotional crisis was now seen as the result of deliberate manipulation and online cruelty. For the Meyers, the revelation brought no comfort, only a deeper layer of pain. Following the revelation that the Josh Evans account had been a fabricated identity orchestrated by Lori Drew and others, public calls for legal accountability intensified. However, the path to prosecution proved far more complex than many had anticipated. At the time, Missouri had no specific law addressing cyberbullying or the use of false identities online in a manner that could lead to emotional harm. Local law enforcement and prosecutors initially struggled to identify a chargeable offense. Although the ethical implications of Drew's actions were widely condemned, Missouri statutes did not clearly criminalize the behavior involved. The Meyers, frustrated by the legal limitations, continued to speak out and advocate for justice. Eventually, federal authorities stepped in. In 2008, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles charged Lori Drew under the Federal Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, CFAA. The charges were based on the premise that Drew had violated MySpace's terms of service by creating a fictitious profile and using it to obtain information under false pretenses. Prosecutors argued that this constituted unauthorized access to a protected computer. Drew was indicted on 4 counts, 1 felony count of conspiracy and 3 misdemeanor counts of unauthorized computer access. The legal strategy was unprecedented. The government contended that by violating the user agreement of a social networking site, Drew had committed a federal crime. Critics warned that such an interpretation of the CFAA could criminalize ordinary behavior online. The case went to trial in Los Angeles in late 2008. During the proceedings, Drew's defense argued that she had not intended to harm Megan, and that the messages were meant to be a teenage prank. The defense also contended that applying the CFAA in this context was an overreach. In November 2008, the jury acquitted Drew of the felony conspiracy charge but convicted her on the 3 misdemeanor counts. However, in July 2009, the judge overseeing the case overturned the misdemeanor convictions. He ruled that the government's interpretation of the CFAA was unconstitutionally vague and could criminalize broad swaths of internet activity. With that decision, all charges against Lori Drew were dismissed. The ruling underscored a troubling gap in existing law. While Drew's conduct had undeniably caused harm, the legal system lacked the tools to hold her accountable under current statutes. The dismissal left Megan's family and many others feeling that justice had not been served. This chapter of the case illuminated the difficulty of addressing emerging forms of harm within outdated legal frameworks. It became a rallying point for lawmakers, advocates, and citizens seeking reforms that could prevent similar tragedies in the future. The dismissal of all charges against Lori Drew did not end the impact of Megan Meyer's case. In fact, it marked the beginning of a broader movement to reform laws related to cyberbullying. The case had drawn national attention, prompting lawmakers and citizens alike to question whether existing statutes were adequate to address harm inflicted in the digital realm. In response to public outcry and the evident legal gaps, Missouri lawmakers took swift action. In May 2008, just months after the details of Megan's case became widely known, Missouri passed new legislation amending its harassment laws to include electronic communications. The updated statute criminalized the use of electronic means to cause emotional distress, making it a misdemeanor or felony depending on the circumstances. This legal revision was a direct response to Megan's experience and became one of the first efforts in the United States to address cyberbullying through state law. Other states soon followed, enacting or updating their own laws to cover online harassment, false impersonation, and the use of electronic communications to intimidate or threaten. At the federal level, legislators introduced bills aimed at criminalizing cyberbullying. One proposal, dubbed the Megan Meier Cyberbullying Prevention Act, sought to make it illegal to use electronic communication with the intent to coerce, intimidate, harass, or cause substantial emotional distress. Although it garnered attention, the bill faced opposition over concerns about its impact on free speech, and was ultimately not passed. While legislative progress was uneven, Megan's story became a catalyst for a national dialogue about the responsibilities of Internet users, the limits of online anonymity, and the accountability of platforms hosting user content. Her case highlighted the urgent need for updated laws that could effectively address new forms of harm in a digital society. Parallel to the legal developments, Tina Meier founded the Megan Meier Foundation in 2007. The organization's mission was to prevent bullying and cyberbullying, and to promote positive support for children, teenagers, and parents. Through school programs, community outreach, and advocacy, the foundation worked to educate others about the dangers of online abuse and the importance of empathy. Tina Meier became a national voice on the issue, speaking at schools, conferences, and legislative hearings. Her message was grounded in experience and grief, but also in a determination to prevent other families from enduring similar tragedies. The foundation partnered with schools and communities across the country to implement anti-bullying initiatives and offer support to students in crisis. The legislative and advocacy efforts born from Megan's story changed the conversation about bullying in the United States. No longer seen solely as a physical or in-person phenomenon, bullying was now understood as something that could occur invisibly and relentlessly through screens. Megan's case became a defining moment in that shift. Megan Meier's death marked a pivotal moment in the national awareness of cyberbullying and its consequences. Her story was widely publicized across media outlets, in public service campaigns, and through school curricula. It resonated deeply with parents, educators, lawmakers, and students, highlighting how virtual interactions could have devastating real-world impacts. In classrooms and homes across the country, discussions about responsible online behavior began to intensify. Schools revisited their anti-bullying policies to include cyberbullying as a distinct category of misconduct. Counselors and educators began using Megan's story to teach digital ethics and the potential psychological harm caused by anonymous or deceptive communication online. Social media platforms also began to come under scrutiny. Companies like MySpace, Facebook, and later Twitter and Instagram were urged to take stronger stances against online harassment. While some changes were made, including easier reporting tools and content moderation guidelines, critics argued that platforms needed to do more to protect young users from abuse. Megan's case became a reference point in debates over online anonymity. While some defended the right to privacy and free expression, others argued that the ability to create fake identities allowed malicious actors to operate without accountability. The balance between privacy and protection, especially for minors, became a recurring theme in legislative and ethical discussions. The work of the Megan Meyer Foundation expanded as the years went on. It provided a platform not just for advocacy, but also for healing and education. The foundation launched initiatives such as student-led programs, peer mentorship, and parent education workshops. It focused on empowering young people to speak up, support one another, and recognize the signs of bullying. Tina Meyer's involvement in these efforts brought a deeply personal authenticity to the movement. Her advocacy moved beyond Megan's specific case to address broader mental health issues facing youth, including depression, anxiety, and suicide prevention. She often spoke of the importance of early intervention and open communication between parents and children. While laws evolved and awareness grew, the complexities of cyberbullying remained. New platforms emerged, and with them, new challenges in regulation and safety. Yet, the story of Megan Meyer continued to be cited in academic research, policy discussions, and public forums as a reminder of what could happen when technology is misused. The broader impact of Megan's story extended well beyond O'Fallon, Missouri. It helped spark a cultural and legal reckoning with how society addresses emotional abuse in the digital age. Though she did not live to see the changes inspired by her story, Megan Meyer's legacy influenced a movement dedicated to ensuring that such a tragedy would not be repeated. Natali Holloway arrived in Aruba on May 26, 2005, with 124 fellow graduates and 7 chaperones from Mountain Brook High School in Alabama. The trip was a rite of passage, an annual senior tradition meant to celebrate the end of high school and the beginning of adulthood. Natalie, 18, had just completed her studies and was planning to attend the University of Alabama on a full scholarship to study pre-med. Her reputation among peers was that of a high-achieving, responsible student with a strong social circle. The group stayed at the Holiday Inn in Palm Beach, a popular area with American tourists. Over the course of the trip, the students enjoyed the nightlife, mingling with other tourists and locals, frequenting beachside clubs and bars. The atmosphere was light-hearted and festive. There were no mandatory check-ins or strict curfews. The chaperones provided oversight, but gave students autonomy. This was a celebration, and for many of them, it was their first taste of adult independence. On the evening of May 29th, Natalie and several classmates went to the Carlos and Charlie's nightclub in Oranjestad, one of the island's busiest tourist spots. The club was known for its energetic atmosphere and its popularity among young American tourists. Witnesses later reported that Natalie appeared to be enjoying herself, dancing, socializing, and drinking. As the night progressed, Natalie was seen leaving the club around 1:30 a.m. on May 30th with Joran van der Sloot, a 17-year-old Dutch national living in Aruba, and 2 Surinamese brothers, Deepak and Sadish Kalpo. The 3 young men were familiar to several members of the Mountain Brook group. Van der Sloot was known to frequent tourist areas and had reportedly interacted with the students earlier during their trip. Natalie got into a gray Honda with the 3 young men. According to later accounts, this was the last time any of her classmates or chaperones saw her. The morning of May 30th began quietly. When Natalie failed to appear for her flight home later that day, alarms were raised. Her packed luggage was found in her hotel room, but her bed appeared unused from the night before. Chaperones began calling local hospitals and police stations, hoping she had turned up somewhere disoriented or sick. When those calls yielded nothing, the gravity of the situation set in. Natalie's mother, Beth Holloway, was informed and flew to Aruba immediately, arriving later that evening with friends and family. She wasted no time. Accompanied by local law enforcement, Beth went directly to the van der Sloot residence. Joran's father, Paul van der Sloot, initially denied his son had seen Natalie, but later facilitated a conversation. That same night, Joran told police he had driven Natalie to the California Lighthouse area of the island and left her on the beach around 2 a.m., claiming she was intoxicated but insisted she wanted to be alone. The Aruban authorities officially opened a missing persons case, initiating the first of many searches and interviews. The formal search for Natalie Holloway began on May 31, 2005. The urgency was palpable from the outset. Local police, joined by volunteers, began combing the beaches, hotel grounds, and surrounding areas near the California Lighthouse, the location Joran van der Sloot had claimed to last see her. Within days, the search expanded dramatically. The Aruban government assigned dozens of police officers to the case, and soon volunteers from Aruba and the United States joined in. Aruba's Coast Guard dispatched boats and helicopters. Divers were brought in to examine nearby waters, while sniffer dogs were used on land. Beth Holloway established a command post at the Holiday Inn. Flyers with Natalie's picture and a contact number were posted throughout the island. Natalie's father, Dave Holloway, also flew to Aruba, focusing his efforts on physical searches with volunteers. The family split responsibilities. Beth maintained media visibility and liaison with the police, while Dave concentrated on tracking movements and locations. Initial interviews with van der Sloot and the Kalpoe brothers produced inconsistencies. The Kalpoes initially supported Joran's account, that they dropped off Joran and Natalie at the beach before returning home. But as questions mounted, their version began to diverge. At one point, the brothers claimed that they had dropped Natalie and Joran off at the Holiday Inn instead, contradicting Joran's lighthouse narrative. Hotel security footage, however, showed no evidence of Natalie's return that night. On June 5th, authorities arrested 2 former security guards from a nearby hotel, citing suspicious behavior. However, the guards were released within days due to a lack of evidence. Their detainment had stemmed from a statement by Joran van der Sloot, who had implicated them in an apparent attempt to redirect suspicion. The tactic only deepened scrutiny on him. On June 9th, police arrested Joran van der Sloot and the Kalpoe brothers. Their homes were searched. Investigators seized computers, phones, and other personal effects. Under questioning, the 3 gave various conflicting statements. Joran claimed he left Natalie on the beach. The Kalpoes shifted timelines. Investigators grew frustrated. Without physical evidence or a consistent narrative, progress stalled. Meanwhile, the American media had descended upon Aruba. News outlets from across the U.S. ran wall-to-wall coverage of the case. Satellite trucks lined the roads near the hotels and police stations. The Holloway family held frequent press briefings. The emotional appeals and increasing public pressure added complexity to an already strained investigation. Aruban officials publicly stated their commitment to solving the case, but behind the scenes, investigators grappled with a lack of forensics and contradictory statements. Divers scoured offshore locations, even exploring the seabed near the Aruba landfill. Psychics offered unsolicited theories, some of which were followed up on in desperation. Despite the massive scale of the search, no trace of Natalie's body, clothing, or possessions were found. Leads emerged and faded. Rumors spread quickly. Every new sighting or tip was investigated. None led to Natalie. By late June, with no concrete evidence and suspects offering little clarity, the investigation began to stall. The Aruban legal system, constrained by Dutch procedural rules, required more than suspicion for long-term detainment. The Kalpo brothers were released on July 4th. Joran van der Sloot remained in custody longer, but was ultimately released in September. Beth Holloway continued to assert publicly that the suspects knew what had happened. She accused them repeatedly of lying and demanded further action. Aruban officials, in turn, called for patience and cooperation. Tensions between the Holloway family and local authorities escalated, each side frustrated by the lack of resolution. The disappearance had now extended beyond a local investigation. It had become a geopolitical and media spectacle. Yet, as the months wore on, the absence of new evidence left a void that neither media nor manpower could fill. With the disappearance of Natalee Holloway gaining global attention, the focus turned sharply onto the three young men last seen with her: Joran van der Sloot and brothers Deepak and Satish Kalpo. Each of them became central figures in a case plagued by conflicting stories and procedural missteps. Joran van der Sloot, a student living in Aruba with his family, was known for gambling and nightlife. His father, Paul van der Sloot, was a prominent judge in training in the Aruban legal system. This family connection would later raise questions about influence and access. Deepak and Satish Kalpos were of Surinamese descent, living in Aruba and working in information technology and at a car rental agency, respectively. When initially questioned, the three young men told police that after leaving Carlos and Charlie's, they had driven Natalee to the Holiday Inn. They claimed she exited the car, stumbling toward the lobby, and that they left immediately afterward. Hotel security footage, however, did not corroborate this account. Days later, their story changed. Joran now said he and Natalee went to the beach near the Marriott Hotel, where he left her alone after she allegedly insisted she wanted to stay behind. Their shifting narratives undermined their credibility. On June 9, 2005, all three were arrested on suspicion of involvement in Natalee's disappearance. Aruban police searched their homes, seizing computers, clothing, and other items. In custody, the suspects were interrogated separately. Interrogation records later revealed inconsistencies and contradictions, especially in timelines and details of the night. The Kalpo brothers repeatedly pointed to Joran as the last person with Natalee. Joran, in turn, offered several versions of events. At one point, he claimed that Natalee had collapsed on the beach and that he left her there. In another version, he said that he had left her alone, but saw her being approached by another man. These narratives did not hold under scrutiny. During this period, law enforcement also arrested and released several other individuals based on tips or tenuous links to the case, including local men who had reportedly been seen near the beach area. None of these detentions resulted in charges or new leads. The legal system in Aruba, based on Dutch law, requires significant evidence to maintain long-term detainment. Despite the public suspicion, authorities struggled to present enough proof to hold the three main suspects. Still, they were kept under surveillance. The pressure on the investigation team grew as each new interview or search failed to produce definitive answers. Meanwhile, the suspects began to turn on one another. In one police statement, Deepak Kalpo implied that Joran had returned home much later than he initially claimed, suggesting something may have occurred after their separation. Joran denied this. Satish, usually the quietest, offered limited responses, often aligning his version with his brother's. Despite hopes that the intense questioning would break the group's cohesion and yield confessions or incriminating contradictions, the suspects maintained that they had not harmed Natalee. Duran's father became a focus of public criticism after he was temporarily detained for withholding information. He denied any involvement and was released without charges. In August 2005, Deepak and Satish were rearrested briefly, followed by Duran in September. Again, the rearrests were tied to newly interpreted evidence or emerging witness statements. Yet none of this led to formal charges. Without a body or forensic proof, the case remained circumstantial. By the end of 2005, all three were released. The public, especially in the United States, reacted with frustration. The Holloway family accused the suspects of deceit and blamed the Aruban authorities for failing to apply sufficient pressure. The suspects, now vilified in the media, remained on the island, their movements and statements tracked relentlessly. The investigation into Natalee Holloway's disappearance had begun with high hopes and urgent effort, but with the first suspects released and no resolution in sight, the case stood at a dangerous standstill, mired in rumor, legal constraint, and international scrutiny. As the investigation stalled, the disappearance of Natalee Holloway transformed from a criminal inquiry into an international media phenomenon. By mid-June 2005, American cable networks had made the story a daily feature. Major broadcasters dispatched correspondents to Aruba, turning the island into a high-profile crime scene under relentless coverage. Natalee's story gripped audiences in the United States. The image of a bright, college-bound teenager vanishing on a school trip was both haunting and relatable. News outlets framed the narrative around the personal anguish of the Holloway family. Beth Holloway, poised and forceful in interviews, became the case's most visible spokesperson. Her presence on news shows kept attention focused and intensified pressure on Aruban authorities. Television anchors aired theories, dissected police strategies, and critiqued the handling of suspects. Joran van der Sloot and the Kalpoe brothers were scrutinized publicly before any legal proceedings could clarify their roles. Interview clips were played repeatedly, and every new twist was reported as a potential breakthrough. Surveillance footage, cell phone records, and police leaks fueled a continuous news cycle. This media environment created new challenges for investigators. Rumors became indistinguishable from facts. Claims of corruption, incompetence, and cover-ups circulated online and in tabloids. Every delay in the investigation fed public suspicion. Beth Holloway's frustrations with the Aruban government were shared openly, increasing tensions between her family and local officials. Tourism on the island, a vital economic sector, took a hit. Some American travelers canceled trips, citing safety concerns or solidarity with the Holloways. Aruban officials, concerned about the island's reputation, began facing diplomatic pressure. U.S. lawmakers weighed in. Some called for boycotts or suspensions of aid. Aruba's prime minister and law enforcement leaders were forced to defend their conduct in international interviews. Despite growing international attention, the case remained unresolved. Investigators, now operating under media glare, revisited earlier leads and tried to verify timelines. Joran van der Sloot participated in several on-camera interviews, alternately defensive and evasive. In one, he reiterated his claim of leaving Natalee alone on the beach. In others, he made statements that contradicted prior accounts. His public image deteriorated rapidly. Private investigators hired by the Holloway family pursued alternative leads. Volunteers continued searching beaches and remote areas. Tip lines were flooded with messages from people claiming to have seen or heard something significant. Most were dead ends. Some tips sent authorities on days-long searches in swamps or at sea, yielding nothing. The Holloway family's public campaign never wavered. they distributed flyers, launched a website, and coordinated with nonprofit groups to increase awareness. Television appearances became an essential tactic for keeping the pressure on. Each media moment was another reminder to viewers that Natalie was still missing and answers were still elusive. As the case entered its second year, the media presence persisted, but hope of a quick resolution faded. The central figures, Joran, the Kalpos, and the Holloway family remained locked in a public narrative that moved faster than the legal system could respond to. What began as a missing person report had now become a symbol of procedural breakdown, media saturation, and cultural dissonance. The international spotlight brought visibility, but it also complicated every move investigators tried to make. The intensity of coverage never translated into evidence, and while the story reached millions, Natalie Holloway remained missing. By 2006, the Holloway case was mired in uncertainty. No physical evidence had been found. The suspects had been released and rearrested without resolution. But it was Joran van der Sloot's shifting narratives that increasingly dominated the case. Over time, his public and private statements diverged so drastically that investigators, journalists, and observers struggled to determine what was credible. Initially, van der Sloot maintained he had last seen Natalie on the beach near the Marriott Hotel. But as pressure mounted, he offered several variations of that story. In one, Natalie asked to be left alone. In another, she had fallen and appeared unwell. At one point, he claimed she had been picked up by another individual. Each version added ambiguity, yet none produced new leads or evidence. In 2006, Dutch crime reporter Peter R. de Vries began investigating the case independently. His team conducted surveillance and arranged covert recordings. These efforts culminated in a 2008 televised broadcast showing van der Sloot speaking to a man he believed to be a confidant, describing Natalie's death. In the hidden camera footage, he claimed she had convulsed and died on the beach, and that a friend helped dispose of her body at sea. The broadcast caused an international uproar. Despite the apparent confession, Aruban authorities were unable to corroborate any part of the story. Joran later recanted the statements, saying he had fabricated the story under the influence of marijuana to impress the man he was speaking with. The lack of supporting evidence meant the admission could not be used to bring charges. These events reinforced the difficulties faced by prosecutors. Aruba's legal system required substantial material evidence or consistent, credible testimony. Neither had emerged. Prosecutors submitted new case files based on the hidden camera footage, but the court found insufficient grounds to detain van der Sloot. Meanwhile, Deepak and Satish Kalpo also re-entered the public narrative. Their accounts remained largely consistent with earlier interviews, though both distanced themselves from van der Sloot. Deepak, in interviews, expressed frustration that he had been drawn into the case and maintained he had not been present during the critical hours. Both brothers continued to live on the island under sporadic media scrutiny. In late 2007, Dutch investigators conducted a comprehensive review of the entire case file. Working with new forensic tools and digital analysis, they re-interviewed witnesses and re-evaluated the existing evidence. Despite extensive effort, their final report concluded that there was insufficient evidence to prosecute. The case, while technically open, reached a legal impasse. That same year, authorities in Aruba formally declared Natalie Holloway's case as unsolved but inactive. They maintained that the investigation could be reopened if new, credible information emerged. This announcement was met with disappointment and anger by the Holloway family, who felt that the prime suspect had effectively escaped justice through deception and manipulation. Throughout this period, von der Sloot's behavior became increasingly erratic. He gave interviews in various countries, made contradictory statements, and occasionally appeared in media events that reignited public anger. He continued to insist he knew nothing definitive about Natalie's fate, even as his own credibility deteriorated with each new appearance. Legal setbacks, contradictory statements, and procedural limitations all contributed to a growing sense of frustration. For the Holloway family, the most painful aspect was the lack of closure. No trial, no body, no final answer. The case had become a tangle of narratives, media-driven speculation, legal constraints, and a suspect who thrived in ambiguity. Without new evidence, the legal system was powerless. And so, the story of Natalie Holloway remained unresolved, suspended between rumor and reality. From the beginning of the investigation, the physical search for Natalie Holloway became one of the most extensive in Aruba's history. Law enforcement, volunteers, and private organizations combed the island and surrounding waters for any trace of the missing teenager. Yet, despite the resources deployed and the attention given, no forensic evidence linking anyone to a crime was ever recovered. In the early days, the initial focus was on the beach areas near the Marriott Hotel, the location Joran van der Sloot claimed to have last seen Natalie. Local police conducted searches on foot, by ATV, and with K9 units. Volunteers from both Aruba and the United States joined in, scouring remote areas, drainage ponds, and undeveloped land. Search teams included divers and marine experts who combed the waters off the island's northwest coast. The depth, currents, and complex marine terrain made this work difficult and often inconclusive. Sonar imaging was used in deeper offshore locations. Meanwhile, the FBI provided forensic and technical support, collaborating with local authorities and assisting in the analysis of leads. A landfill outside Oranjestad became a major focus after several witness accounts suggested that something may have been dumped there around the time of Natalie's disappearance. For days, search teams sifted through tons of garbage with heavy machinery and dogs trained to detect human remains. The effort yielded nothing. Multiple anonymous tips led investigators to abandoned buildings, remote caves, and wells. In one notable instance, authorities drained a pond in the northwest sector of the island. Despite days of labor and anticipation, no human remains or relevant evidence were found. Another effort involved ground-penetrating radar in locations identified by psychics and tipsters. Again, nothing of substance emerged. In the months that followed, as public attention waned, the search efforts became more selective, guided by informants and new statements. Some of these came from individuals claiming to have overheard the suspects or had been told secondhand information. In one instance, a former friend of van der Sloot suggested that a body had been buried under a house that was under construction at the time. Investigators dug up part of the foundation. Nothing was found. Private funding from the Holloway family helped sustain many of these efforts. They hired search and recovery specialists with experience in missing persons and disaster response. A Texas-based search and rescue group brought cadaver dogs and conducted their own assessments. These private searches were often more aggressive than the official ones, but still failed to locate any conclusive evidence. Several years into the investigation, interest in high-tech search methods increased. Submersible cameras were used to inspect deeper waters. Some searchers proposed theories involving disposal in underwater caves or shipping containers. Still, no confirmed sightings, objects, or remains connected to Natalie emerged. Each time a promising lead arose, it was met with intense scrutiny and hope, but the disappointment that followed each fruitless search wore down optimism. The Holloway family remained involved, monitoring all developments and frequently returning to Aruba. By 2008, most physical searches had ended or transitioned to standby mode, with investigators stating that only new, actionable intelligence could justify further operations. The lack of physical evidence, no body, no clothing, no personal items, remained the central obstacle in prosecuting any suspect. The legal requirement for proof was unmet, and the absence of physical findings turned the case into a ghost that haunted public memory without providing resolution. The terrain of Aruba had been mapped, scanned, and turned over. The ocean floor had been surveyed and dredged, yet Natalie Holloway remained missing, and no piece of evidence had been found to illuminate the truth of what had happened after she left the nightclub that night. Following his release from Aruban custody, Joran van der Sloot's life unfolded under a cloud of suspicion and international scrutiny. His post-2005 actions were closely monitored, and over the years, he continued to draw attention through a pattern of erratic behavior, travel, and repeated involvement in controversies. In the years immediately after Natalie Holloway's disappearance, van der Sloot granted several interviews to news outlets. In these appearances, he often contradicted his previous statements. At times, he claimed to know what had happened to Natalie. At others, he denied all involvement. These inconsistencies continued to erode his credibility and cemented his reputation as an unreliable narrator. His movements during this period also raised concern. He traveled extensively through Europe, Asia, and South America, staying in different countries for short periods. He appeared in Thailand in 2008, where he was reportedly involved in an online gambling business. Allegations emerged that he was using fake identities and targeting vulnerable individuals, though no charges resulted. By 2010, van der Sloot resurfaced in Peru. There, he met Stephanie Flores, a 21-year-old Peruvian business student in a Lima casino. The two were seen together on surveillance cameras leaving the casino and entering van der Sloot's hotel room on May 30th, exactly 5 years to the day after Natalie Holloway was last seen. What followed marked a turning point. Stephanie Flores was found dead in van der Sloot's hotel room on June 2nd. She had suffered blunt force trauma to the head. Evidence, including surveillance footage and forensic findings, led Peruvian police to quickly identify van der Sloot as the primary suspect. He had fled the country, crossing into Chile, where he was captured and extradited to Peru. Under interrogation, van der Sloot confessed to the murder. He stated that he had killed Flores after she discovered material on his laptop, linking him to the Holloway case. The confession was graphic and self-incriminating. He later recanted parts of it, but the evidence was overwhelming. In 2012, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to 28 years in prison. The verdict provided a sense of justice, but for the Holloway family, it was a grim confirmation of long-held suspicions about his capacity for violence. Van der Sloot's imprisonment did not end his connection to the Holloway case. In 2010, shortly before the Peru murder, he had contacted Beth Holloway's legal representatives, offering information about Natalie's whereabouts in exchange for money. An FBI sting operation followed, and van der Sloot accepted $25,000 as part of the arrangement. The information he provided turned out to be false. He had claimed that Natalie was buried in the foundation of a house, but the site was investigated and yielded nothing. The U.S. Department of Justice subsequently charged van der Sloot with wire fraud and extortion. The charges remained pending due to his incarceration in Peru. Over time, the U.S. continued to negotiate for his extradition to face trial. While in prison, van der Sloot married and fathered a child with a Peruvian woman. He was moved between prisons due to threats from other inmates and accusations of misconduct. His psychological profile, erratic interviews, and media appearances kept him in the public eye even as he served his sentence. Despite being behind bars, Vandersloot's name remains synonymous with the unsolved Holloway case. His continued manipulation of the narrative and the evidence trail further complicated efforts to achieve closure. Each public statement he made reignited interest and pain for the Holloway family, who continued to press for legal accountability in the United States. Joran Vandersloot had become more than a suspect. He was a figure whose actions spanned borders, legal systems, and crimes. The timeline of his life after 2005 painted a portrait of instability and violence that only deepened the questions surrounding what had truly happened to Natalee Holloway. The murder of Stephanie Flores brought Joran Vandersloot back into the international spotlight and confirmed the suspicions many had long harbored. Occurring exactly 5 years after the disappearance of Natalee Holloway, the killing shocked the public and shifted the narrative from speculation to certainty regarding Vandersloot's capacity for violence. Stephanie Flores was a 21-year-old Peruvian university student from a well-known family in Lima. On May 29, 2010, she met Vandersloot at a casino. Surveillance cameras recorded the two leaving together and entering his hotel room in the early morning hours of May 30th. Vandersloot checked into the hotel under his real name and paid in cash. 3 days later, hotel staff entered the room after noticing the guest had not returned and found Flores's body. She had been beaten to death. Blood was found throughout the room, and signs of a struggle were evident. An autopsy revealed that she died from blunt force trauma and internal injuries. Vandersloot had fled shortly after the murder, taking a bus across the border into Chile. Peruvian authorities issued an international warrant, and he was arrested in Santiago on June 3rd. He was extradited to Peru and taken into custody in Lima. Under questioning, Vandersloot initially confessed to the crime. He claimed he had attacked Flores after she used his laptop without permission and found references to the Holloway case. The confession was detailed and matched evidence from the scene. However, he later attempted to withdraw it, stating it was made under duress. Peruvian law enforcement confirmed that the confession aligned with forensic findings. The murder deeply impacted public perception. Where Natalee Holloway's case had long suffered from a lack of resolution, the killing of Stephanie Flores left no ambiguity. There was a body, a timeline, forensic evidence, and a confession. Vandersloot was no longer a suspect. He was a convicted killer. In January 2012, a Peruvian court found Vandersloot guilty of the murder and sentenced him to 28 years in prison. The trial, though swift, was widely covered. For the Flora family, the sentence brought a measure of justice. For the Holloways, it was a bitter confirmation. Though not directly tied to Natalee's case, the conviction reinforced the belief that Vandersloot was responsible for her disappearance. The Peru conviction also revitalized efforts in the United States to bring Vandersloot to trial for extortion and wire fraud. In 2010, shortly before the murder of Flores, he had solicited money from Natalee's mother in exchange for information about the location of her daughter's remains. The information turned out to be false, but the financial transaction had been monitored and recorded by the FBI. These actions formed the basis for U.S. federal charges. Due to his incarceration in Peru, the U.S. charges remained unresolved for years. However, the Peruvian government later agreed to temporarily extradite Vandersloot to the United States to face those charges, contingent upon his return to serve the remainder of his sentence in Peru. This development underscored the international dimension of his legal entanglements. The murder of Stephanie Flores added a second victim to the narrative that had begun in Aruba. It confirmed the fears that a failure to hold Vandersloot accountable in 2005 may have led to further tragedy. For many, it transformed the case from a mystery into a cautionary tale about justice delayed. As Vandersloot served his time in a Peruvian prison, his name remained entangled in two countries' legal systems and two families' grief. The death of Stephanie Flores had brought one chapter to a legal conclusion, but the original case, the disappearance of Natalee Holloway, remained unresolved. In October 2023, after nearly 2 decades of uncertainty, Joran Vandersloot confessed to the murder of Natalee Holloway. This admission came as part of a plea agreement in a U.S. federal court in Birmingham, Alabama, where Vandersloot faced charges of extortion and wire fraud related to his 2010 attempt to solicit money from Holloway's mother in exchange for information about her daughter's whereabouts. During the proceedings, Vandersloot provided a detailed account of the events on the night of May 30th, 2005. He recounted that after leaving a nightclub together, he and Natalee walked along the beach. When he made sexual advances toward her, she resisted and kneed him. In retaliation, he kicked her in the face, rendering her unconscious. He then found a cinder block nearby and used it to strike her head, ultimately killing her. Afterwards, he disposed of her body in the ocean. This confession was a condition of his plea deal, which required him to disclose all information about Holloway's disappearance. The court accepted his guilty plea for the extortion charges and sentenced him to 20 years in prison to run concurrently with his existing sentence in Peru for the 2010 murder of Stephanie Flores. Beth Holloway, Natalee's mother, attended the court proceedings. She expressed a sense of relief, stating that Vandersloot's admission provided the answers she had sought for years. Despite the confession, Vandersloot cannot be prosecuted for Holloway's murder in Aruba due to the expiration of the statute of limitations for the crime. The confession marked a significant moment in the long-standing case, offering a measure of closure to Holloway's family and bringing an end to years of speculation and unanswered questions. Joran Vandersloot's confession in 2023 closed one chapter in a case that had gripped public attention for nearly 2 decades. Yet even with his admission, the legal and emotional consequences of the Natalee Holloway case continued to ripple through multiple systems and societies. Under the terms of the plea deal reached in the United States, Vandersloot was sentenced to 20 years for extortion and wire fraud. This sentence was to be served concurrently with his existing 28-year sentence in Peru for the 2010 murder of Stephanie Flores. The plea agreement mandated his eventual return to Peruvian custody after the completion of the U.S. proceedings. Despite confessing to killing Holloway, Vandersloot could not be tried for her murder under Aruban law due to the expiration of the statute of limitations. The confession, though not legally actionable in Aruba, was formally documented and verified through court proceedings in the United States. This acknowledgement carried immense symbolic weight. For the Holloway family, it represented a painful but critical confirmation of what had long been suspected. For law enforcement and legal authorities, it offered a final account from the only person believed to know the truth. The legal handling of the case, spanning jurisdictions in Aruba, the United States, and Peru, highlighted the complexities of cross-border criminal investigations. Differences in legal standards, extradition treaties, and prosecutorial limitations delayed accountability. In the process, the Holloway case exposed gaps in international cooperation for cases involving missing persons and suspects who flee national borders. In the years following the initial disappearance, Beth Holloway became a prominent advocate for victims' families. She established the Natalie Holloway Resource Center to support families facing similar crises, focusing on prevention and education. Her public presence kept attention on the challenges families face when a loved one goes missing abroad. She also pushed for stronger legislative protections and improved international protocols. The case led to calls for reforms in Aruba and contributed to broader discussions in the United States about the treatment of missing persons cases involving U.S. citizens overseas. Though no single policy overhaul resulted directly from the Holloway case, it became a case study in the need for better coordination between nations and agencies. In popular culture, the case had already cemented its place long before Vandersloot's confession. Numerous books, documentaries, and dramatizations were produced over the years. Media coverage often blurred the lines between journalism and sensationalism, but the public fascination with the case never waned. The final admission of guilt did little to erase the years of speculation and conflicting narratives that had dominated headlines. The emotional toll on the Holloway family remained visible. While Beth Holloway acknowledged the relief brought by Vandersloot's confession, she also recognized that the lack of physical remains meant a traditional sense of closure would remain elusive. Dave Holloway, who had spearheaded early search efforts and multiple expeditions, expressed similar sentiments. The legacy of the Natalie Holloway case endures not only through its legal implications, but also through its social impact. It prompted reflection on the responsibilities of law enforcement, the role of media in criminal investigations, and the resilience of families navigating tragedy in the public eye. In the end, the truth emerged not through forensic evidence or courtroom trials, but through a belated confession. The answers came too late to bring justice in the legal sense, but they closed a narrative that had remained unresolved for far too long. For those who followed the case, and especially for those who lived it, the story of Natalie Holloway remains a reminder of the pursuit of truth against immense odds. Tina Fontaine, a 15-year-old girl from the Sagkeeng First Nation in Manitoba, Canada, was last seen in Winnipeg on August 8, 2014. She had been reported missing by her great-aunt, Thelma Favell, who had raised Tina for most of her life. Tina had traveled to Winnipeg in late June 2014 to reconnect with her biological mother. The city, however, soon became a place of vulnerability for her. In the weeks before her disappearance, Tina came into contact with multiple social service agencies, health workers, and the police. Each time, her precarious situation was evident. She was in contact with Child and Family Services, CFS, who placed her in a hotel, a practice common at the time due to a shortage of proper foster placements. She was also seen by hospital staff and came into contact with the Winnipeg Police Service. Notably, she was reported missing twice before she disappeared for good. Tina's vulnerable state was evident. On August 8th, she was found sleeping in an alley and was brought to the hospital. Later that day, she had an interaction with the police. Despite her being listed as a missing person and visibly underage, officers did not detain her. This would be among the last confirmed sightings of her alive. The period between August 8th and August 17th is murky. During these 9 days, Tina fell completely out of contact with those who had tried to help her. Her presence vanished from city streets, social services, and shelters. Her phone stopped being used. Those close to her grew increasingly worried. The case was about to take a tragic turn. On August 17, 2014, the Winnipeg Police Service received a call about a suspicious object spotted in the Red River near the Alexander Docks. The river, known for its murky waters and slow current, carried with it a dark secret that would ignite national outrage. The police pulled a body from the water, wrapped in a duvet cover, and weighted down with rocks. An autopsy later confirmed the worst. It was Tina Fontaine. The discovery shocked the community. The manner of concealment pointed to an effort to hide the body, suggesting foul play. She had been reported missing, yet her body was discarded in a manner designed to erase her presence. Although the autopsy did not determine a definitive cause of death, the circumstances under which she was found, weighed down and hidden, indicated homicide. Toxicology revealed alcohol and cannabis in her system, adding to the complexity of the investigation. Public reaction was swift. Tina's death underscored systemic failures in how Indigenous youth were treated within child welfare, health, and policing systems. Her petite frame, weighing barely 72 pounds, and the details of her death amplified public empathy and anger. Vigils were held. Politicians and community leaders called for reforms. Indigenous leaders demanded justice, not only for Tina, but for the many other missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls across Canada. Investigators turned their focus to Tina's last known movements. Surveillance footage, witness interviews, and cell phone records became central to tracing her final days. The condition of the body made determining the time and place of death challenging. Despite the forensic difficulties, the police pressed forward, fueled by public demand for answers. Tina's story had become a national symbol, one demanding accountability and change. Following the recovery of Tina Fontaine's body, the Winnipeg Police Service launched a major investigation. A specialized homicide unit took the lead, piecing together her last known movements and attempting to identify anyone who had contact with her during the crucial period between August 8th and August 17th. Investigators combed through surveillance footage from downtown Winnipeg, known to have many cameras due to high foot traffic and crime monitoring initiatives. They interviewed numerous individuals Tina had interacted with, including social workers, hospital staff, shelter employees, and police officers. One focal point of the investigation became the evening of August 8th, when Tina had a documented interaction with two police officers. She had been a passenger in a truck that was pulled over. Despite being listed as a missing person, she was not detained or taken to a safe place. Further interviews led police to Raymond Cormier, a man in his 50s with a history of criminal activity and known to have spent time in the same areas as Tina. Cormier was identified as having had interactions with her and was interviewed early in the investigation. His name continued to resurface during the probe. Witness accounts, coupled with wiretap operations and surveillance, kept him on the police's radar. Law enforcement conducted an undercover operation, using wiretaps to record Cormier over several months. In these recordings, he made numerous statements about Tina. While not outright confessions, some of his comments raised red flags. He spoke of her in the past tense, mentioned fear of going to jail over her, and referenced details about her death that had not been made public. Despite these statements, the case lacked clear forensic evidence directly linking Cormier to the death. There were no eyewitnesses, no conclusive cause of death, and no physical evidence placing him at the scene of a crime. Still, after reviewing months of surveillance, interviews, and recordings, the Crown determined there was sufficient basis to lay a charge. In December 2015, more than a year after Tina's body was found, Raymond Cormier was charged with second-degree murder. Raymond Cormier's trial began in January 2018 at the Manitoba Court of Queen's Bench in Winnipeg. It was a high-profile case, drawing intense public and media interest. The courtroom was filled daily with journalists, indigenous community members, and supporters of Tina Fontaine's family. The trial would scrutinize not only the evidence against Cormier, but also the systemic issues that surrounded Tina's life and death. The Crown's case relied heavily on audio recordings from an undercover police operation. These recordings, collected over months, featured Cormier making multiple statements referencing Tina. He suggested in one recording that she had taken something from him and alluded to retaliating. In another, he said, "She got killed because we found out she was 15, and I drew the line and that's why she got killed." The Crown presented these statements as circumstantial evidence pointing toward his involvement in her death. The defense countered that Cormier's words were vague, speculative, and did not constitute a confession. They argued that the recordings showed a man who liked to talk, often inconsistently, and whose statements were unreliable and lacked corroboration. There was no forensic evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, and no definitive cause of death. The defense emphasized the absence of direct proof that a homicide had even occurred. Throughout the trial, Tina's life was discussed in detail. The jury heard about her upbringing, her struggles in the child welfare system, and her interactions with law enforcement and health services. Witnesses testified about her time in Winnipeg, her vulnerable state, and her last known movements. These details painted a picture of a young girl failed by multiple systems, but also complicated the criminal proceedings, where emotional weight had to be set aside in favor of legal thresholds for guilt. On February 22, 2018, after days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Raymond Cormier was found not guilty of second-degree murder. The decision stunned many. Outside the courthouse, there were tears, anger, and calls for justice. The acquittal did not resolve the many questions surrounding Tina's death. For her family and supporters, the trial's outcome was a profound disappointment, one that reinforced the urgency of addressing systemic gaps and failures. The not guilty verdict in the trial of Raymond Cormier sparked an outpouring of emotion across Canada. Vigils were held in cities and communities nationwide. Indigenous leaders, activists, and everyday citizens voiced frustration and sorrow, arguing that the systems in place had once again failed to protect an Indigenous child. Tina Fontaine's death and the judicial outcome became emblematic of broader issues involving the treatment of Indigenous people within Canadian institutions. Public reaction was immediate and widespread. Social media platforms were flooded with messages of solidarity for Tina's family. Hashtags like #JusticeForTina and #MMIW, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, trended across Canada. Marches and gatherings were organized in Winnipeg, Vancouver, Toronto, and other cities. At these events, participants held signs, shared stories, and lit candles in Tina's memory. Indigenous women who had experienced similar vulnerabilities spoke about their own encounters with systemic neglect. Government officials responded, with several provincial and federal leaders acknowledging the tragedy and vowing reform. Many emphasized the need for deeper collaboration with Indigenous communities, improved oversight of child welfare systems, and enhancements in police protocols for missing youth. In the House of Commons, members of Parliament observed moments of silence and engaged in debates focused on systemic racism and institutional accountability. The verdict also renewed scrutiny of Manitoba's child welfare practices, particularly the use of hotels as placements for vulnerable youth. Tina had been placed in such an environment shortly before her disappearance, a policy criticized for lacking supervision, safety, and appropriate care. In the wake of the trial, Manitoba moved to end the practice of placing children in hotels, instituting emergency reforms in how at-risk youth were accommodated. The case became a turning point in the national conversation about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Calls intensified for a national inquiry, a demand that had been growing for years. Tina's story, alongside countless others, underlined the urgency for action. Her death was not isolated, but part of a larger, deeply rooted crisis. The public response, though mournful, also carried a sense of determination, that Tina's legacy would fuel lasting change. Tina Fontaine's death, along with similar cases, became a catalyst for the establishment of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, MMIWG, which was formally launched in 2016. While the inquiry was already underway by the time of Raymond Cormier's acquittal, the case reinforced the importance of its mandate. The inquiry sought to examine the systemic causes of all forms of violence against Indigenous women and girls in Canada, and to make recommendations for action. Tina's story was frequently cited in testimonies and community hearings across the country. Her life and death represented many of the critical issues raised by families: child welfare failures, police inaction, and a broader social indifference to the risks faced by Indigenous girls. The inquiry's final report, released in 2019, included over 200 recommendations, or calls for justice, targeting governments, institutions, social service providers, and the general public. Among the recommendations were reforms to child welfare practices, improvements in policing, investments in Indigenous-led health and support services, and the establishment of culturally appropriate housing and education programs. The report labeled the violence against Indigenous women and girls a Canadian genocide, sparking national debate and acknowledgement of the depth of systemic racism. Manitoba, in particular, faced scrutiny. In the wake of Tina's case, the provincial government made changes to how child welfare was administered. The controversial practice of housing children in hotels was formally ended. Investments were made in expanding foster placements and Indigenous-led care programs. The province also launched new initiatives to improve youth crisis intervention and provide training for police and service workers dealing with vulnerable populations. On a national level, the Canadian government committed to developing a national action plan based on the inquiry's findings. While the implementation of recommendations has been uneven, Tina's story remains a powerful example of why such changes are necessary. Her case is often referenced in discussions of policy reform and serves as a somber reminder of the human cost of systemic failure. Though legal justice remained elusive, the broader impact of Tina's story contributed to a shift in public awareness and institutional acknowledgement. Her name became a symbol, not just of tragedy, but of the urgent need for comprehensive change across the systems meant to protect the most vulnerable. Years after Tina Fontaine's death, her legacy continues to influence dialogue, policy, and activism across Canada. While her killer was never held legally accountable, the impact of her story has remained strong in both public consciousness and institutional reform efforts. Tina became a national symbol, not only of loss, but of the consequences of long-standing inequities and systemic neglect. Educational campaigns, school curricula, and awareness programs frequently include Tina's story as a central case study. Her image has appeared in murals, art installations, and public memorials dedicated to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. At the Alexander Docks in Winnipeg, where her body was recovered, community members regularly gather to honor her memory and to demand continued progress. Her name is spoken at vigils, marches, and conferences, a reminder of the work still to be done. For her family, the pain remains. Public advocacy has brought some solace, but the absence of justice leaves deep wounds. Thelma Favell, Tina's great-aunt who had cared for her most of her life, has continued to speak out about the failures that led to her death. She has become a key voice in calling for change in child welfare and Indigenous rights, carrying forward Tina's memory as a mission. Despite reforms, questions linger about the actions, or inactions, of various institutions. Why was Tina not taken into protective custody when she was found in a clearly vulnerable state? Why was she placed in an unsupervised hotel instead of a safe care facility? How did a known offender come into close contact with her? These unresolved issues remain subjects of ongoing investigation and policy debate. Annual reports and oversight committees continue to track the progress of recommendations made in the national inquiry, while some advancements have been noted, such as reduced reliance on hotels and increased funding for Indigenous-led child services. Critics argue that the pace of change remains too slow. Advocates call for measurable benchmarks, dedicated funding, and sustained political will. Tina's story did not begin or end with her tragic death. It represents generations of Indigenous youth who face systemic challenges, and it continues to drive efforts aimed at equity and justice. Her legacy is now part of a larger movement, one that refuses to forget and insists on a future where no child is abandoned by the systems meant to protect them. Following Tina Fontaine's death, advocacy for systemic reform became more coordinated and increasingly Indigenous-led. Public institutions were compelled to reevaluate long-standing policies, particularly regarding child protection, youth services, and policing. The push for reform extended into schools, health systems, and community programs, areas where prevention and early intervention were seen as vital to preventing future tragedies. One major shift was in the structure and philosophy of child welfare in Manitoba. Indigenous communities began asserting more control over their own child welfare systems. This move aimed to replace a paternalistic model with one that recognized cultural identity, community ties, and the value of traditional support systems. The goal was not only to keep children safe, but to keep them connected to their heritage and family structures. Winnipeg's police services also faced internal review. Procedures regarding missing persons, particularly minors, were scrutinized. Training modules were updated to include trauma-informed approaches and cultural competency regarding Indigenous histories and realities. Officers were encouraged to treat missing Indigenous youth cases with the same urgency as others, addressing historical patterns of dismissiveness. Public awareness campaigns emerged across Canada, many inspired by Tina's story. These efforts educated citizens about the risks Indigenous girls face, the gaps in current systems, and the importance of community involvement. In schools, Tina's case was included in curriculum discussions around justice, social responsibility, and Canadian history. Museums and public exhibitions featured her story as part of broader explorations of Indigenous experiences and contemporary challenges. Non-profit organizations saw increased support and funding. Grassroots initiatives like youth shelters, mental health outreach programs, and Indigenous mentorship collectives gained traction. Many of these programs focused on harm reduction, cultural reconnection, and providing safe spaces, responding directly to the needs Tina had expressed during her final weeks. Despite the momentum, reform remained uneven. Challenges persisted in funding distribution, coordination among agencies, and accountability. Still, Tina Fontaine's name continued to act as a catalyst. Legislators, social workers, and educators referred to her case when shaping policies or advocating for increased resources. Her image, once a symbol of loss, became one of resilience and responsibility. A call to action that transcended politics and permeated public discourse. In the quiet town of Homosassa, Florida, nestled along the Gulf Coast, life moved at a gentle pace. It was a place where children rode their bikes through leafy streets and neighbors greeted each other by name. Among these families was the Lunsford family, living in a modest home on West Snowbird Court. Jessica Marie Lunsford, a 9-year-old girl with a bright smile and an even brighter spirit, was a third grader at Homosassa Elementary School. Known for her love of singing, her playful energy, and her deep bond with her father, Mark Lunsford, Jessica's life was filled with the ordinary joys of childhood. February 23rd, 2005, began like any other day for the Lunsfords. Jessica spent the evening at home, had dinner with her family, and went to bed in her room at the rear of the house. Her father, who worked long hours as a truck driver, was not home that night, but Jessica was in the care of her grandparents who lived with the family. Her room, filled with toys and school books, was considered a safe haven, a place where she could sleep without fear. But on the morning of February 24th, Jessica was gone. Her grandparents were the first to notice. They discovered her bed empty, the covers pushed back neatly, as if she had simply gotten up and walked away. But Jessica's stuffed animals remained untouched, and there were no signs of forced entry or struggle. Panic set in quickly. Calls to neighbors yielded no information. The Citrus County Sheriff's Office was notified, and within hours, an investigation was underway. The disappearance of a child sent shockwaves through Homosassa. Jessica's face appeared on posters, on the news, and in the windows of businesses across the county. Volunteers gathered in droves, forming search parties that combed through wooded areas, drainage ditches, and abandoned buildings. Deputies went door to door, canvassing the neighborhood and questioning anyone who might have seen something. The media descended on the town, broadcasting Jessica's image across the nation. Her story captured hearts far beyond Florida. The community, united in fear and determination, refused to believe that one of their own could simply vanish without a trace. Each passing hour without a lead deepened the sense of dread. Questions swirled. Had she wandered off? Had she been taken by someone she knew? What nobody knew then was that Jessica had not left the area at all. As investigators intensified their search, the Lunsford family remained in a painful limbo. Mark Lunsford, devastated and desperate, became the face of the effort to find his daughter. His tearful pleas on television were raw and unfiltered, his frustration at the lack of progress boiling just beneath the surface. He refused to leave the house, clinging to the belief that his daughter was nearby and alive. The days turned into weeks. Leads came and went, tips were chased and exhausted. Yet there was still no sign of Jessica. Behind the scenes, investigators were building a timeline, reviewing every possible angle, and starting to look more closely at the people who lived near the Lunsfords. Among them was a man with a troubling past who had quietly returned to Homosassa and was living just a few houses away from where Jessica had disappeared. But that truth had not yet surfaced. The first chapter in the case of Jessica Lunsford closed with more questions than answers. A child had vanished in the night, leaving a family broken and a town on edge. And while the community remained hopeful, the undercurrent of fear was growing stronger. From the morning of February 24th, 2005, the search for Jessica Lunsford unfolded with an urgency that gripped not only the town of Homosassa, but the entire nation. Sheriff's deputies arrived at the Lunsford residence within minutes of the report. The house was secured, and a preliminary search found no evidence of forced entry. Jessica's belongings were undisturbed. Her bedroom window was locked from the inside. Her shoes and backpack sat untouched. To investigators, the scene suggested she had been taken during the night by someone who knew how to avoid detection. Law enforcement activated Florida's missing child alert system. Helicopters circled overhead. Search dogs were deployed through the marshes and wooded areas surrounding the neighborhood. Citrus County officials brought in specialized search teams, including the Mounted Posse and Marine units. Volunteers lined up at a local church to be assigned search areas. Strangers passed out flyers bearing Jessica's photo and the words "missing" in bold print. Hope guided every step, but so did growing dread. Officers interviewed anyone who had contact with Jessica in the days leading up to her disappearance. Her teachers described her as cheerful and active. Her family said she had no history of running away. The media amplified the story, making Jessica's face familiar to millions. Celebrities issued public appeals. Talk shows aired updates. Yet, despite the attention, few credible leads emerged. The sheriff's office established a command center in the neighborhood. They mapped out a quarter-mile radius and began to systematically search every residence. Homes were visited more than once. People were questioned repeatedly. Vehicles were inspected. The neighborhood, usually quiet and trusting, was transformed by a constant police presence. Residents were cooperative but anxious. Forensic teams scoured the Lunsford home for evidence. Technicians dusted surfaces for fingerprints and collected items for DNA testing. Phone records were pulled. Every incoming and outgoing call was scrutinized. Digital data from the family computer was analyzed. Despite these efforts, no clue pointed directly to what had happened that night. The search radius was expanded. Divers entered retention ponds. Landfills were examined. Law enforcement reached out to nearby counties, suspecting that if Jessica had been abducted, she could have been moved quickly. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children offered resources. Jessica's case was entered into national databases. Still, no trace of her was found. Mark Lunsford made daily appearances before the media. His emotional appeals became a fixture of the coverage. He worked closely with law enforcement, but also criticized delays in processing leads. At times, he feared the worst, yet he maintained public optimism. The community rallied around him. Vigils were held. Prayer circles gathered. Hope was kept alive through sheer will. In early March, 2 weeks after Jessica disappeared, authorities brought in outside experts to consult on the case. Behavioral analysts provided profiles of potential offenders. The FBI became involved. Their agents reviewed case files, timelines, and search strategies. Still, no arrests were made, and Jessica remained missing. Each day without progress deepened frustration. Rumors spread. The media speculated. Pressure mounted on investigators to deliver answers. Among the list of persons of interest was a man who had recently moved into a small trailer behind a home just 150 yards from the Lunsford residence. His name was familiar to law enforcement, and his record would soon shift the direction of the investigation. But at this point, his name had not yet surfaced publicly. The search continued without resolution. Jessica's absence left an emptiness in the community. Her classmates were counseled at school. Her teachers left her desk untouched. Local businesses donated food and supplies to search crews. The town streets were lined with yellow ribbons. As the second week drew to a close, there remained only the echo of unanswered questions. How could a child vanish from her bed in the middle of the night? Who had the motive and the opportunity to take her without a sound? The search for Jessica Lunsford had begun as a rescue effort. It was slowly evolving into something else. By early March 2005, the investigation into Jessica Lunsford's disappearance had shifted in tone. Initial optimism began to give way to methodical scrutiny. Detectives, frustrated by a lack of leads, doubled back on early interviews. Their focus narrowed to individuals with criminal records living near the Lunsford home. Among those was John Evander Cooey. Cooey, a 46-year-old with a long criminal history, had quietly taken up residence in a small trailer behind a house on West Snowbird Court, just a few doors down from the Lunsfords. The trailer, poorly maintained and shielded from view by trees and fencing, belonged to a relative. Cooey was a convicted sex offender with prior charges including burglary and molestation. He had failed to register his address with local authorities, violating conditions of his parole. When Cooey was first interviewed, he denied any knowledge of Jessica's disappearance. He appeared nervous, but cooperative. Detectives, without concrete evidence tying him to the crime, let him go. Shortly afterward, Cooey left town. Investigators later discovered he had traveled to Savannah, Georgia, without informing his probation officer, a serious violation. Back in Florida, suspicions about Cooey deepened. Forensic teams were dispatched to the trailer. Inside, they found evidence that would later prove crucial: a mattress stained with biological material and other items that warranted further testing. Traces of blood and DNA were collected. Items belonging to a child were noted, though nothing conclusive was found at the time. Cooey's name was entered into law enforcement databases. Investigators learned more about his background. His record stretched back decades, including multiple arrests for sexual offenses against minors. He had served prison time, but had never received long-term supervision after his release. His movements since arriving in Citrus County had been erratic and poorly monitored. Law enforcement coordinated with authorities in Georgia to locate Cooey. On March 17, 2005, he was found in a homeless shelter in Savannah and taken into custody for questioning regarding his failure to register. Florida authorities traveled to Georgia to interview him. What followed would change the course of the investigation. Initially, Cooey maintained his innocence, but after hours of questioning, during which he was not provided with legal counsel, he eventually admitted to abducting Jessica Lunsford. According to his confession, he entered the Lunsford home in the early hours of February 24th through an unlocked door. He claimed Jessica awoke during the intrusion, and he took her without waking the other occupants of the house. Cooey stated that he brought Jessica back to the trailer, where he kept her hidden for several days. During that time, he repeatedly assaulted her. He claimed he eventually grew fearful that police were closing in and decided to bury her alive in a shallow hole near his residence. The details of his confession were horrifying and deeply disturbing. Following Cooey's confession, investigators returned to the trailer site with a renewed sense of purpose. Forensic excavation teams searched the yard. Behind the trailer, beneath a mound of loosely packed earth, they found the remains of Jessica Lunsford. She was wrapped in plastic garbage bags, her small body positioned in a fetal posture. Autopsy results later confirmed that she had been alive when she was buried. The neighborhood was stunned. The horror that had gripped the community for weeks had now taken a grim and personal turn. The man responsible had been living within sight of the Lunsford home. He had been questioned early in the investigation and released. News of the discovery triggered national outrage. Questions emerged about how a known sex offender had evaded scrutiny. Why had he not been more aggressively monitored? Why had authorities not searched the trailer sooner? The answers were complex and pointed to systemic failures in the management of sexual offenders. John Cooey was extradited to Florida. His confession, though obtained under controversial circumstances, provided investigators with a detailed account of Jessica's final days. The evidence recovered from the trailer, including DNA linking Jessica to the scene, corroborated key elements of Cooey's statement. The revelation marked the end of the search and the beginning of a new phase, a legal process that would be shaped not only by the facts of the case, but also by the raw public emotion it had provoked. With John Cooey in custody and a confession recorded, investigators returned to Florida to verify and solidify the case against him. The circumstances of Jessica Lunsford's death, revealed through Cooey's statement and the physical evidence at the scene, began to take horrifying shape. Forensic technicians revisited the trailer behind the house on West Snowbird Court, this time with a search warrant and a clearer understanding of what to look for. Inside the trailer, they found items that confirmed Jessica had been held there. Fingerprints and hair samples matched hers. The mattress bore bodily fluids consistent with Cooey's description of events. A closet in the trailer showed signs of being used as a hiding place. Duct tape and trash bags were found, items that Cooey mentioned during his confession. In the backyard, forensic anthropologists carefully unearthed the spot where Jessica had been buried. She had been placed in 2 plastic garbage bags, which were tied shut. Her hands were bound with speaker wire. The medical examiner confirmed that she had died of asphyxiation, consistent with being buried alive. The autopsy showed that she had been alive for some time before her death, and that she had suffered prolonged trauma. While the confession provided a disturbing narrative, the physical evidence backed key elements of it. DNA analysis confirmed Jessica's presence in Cooey's trailer. The discovery of her body, exactly where he said it would be, added further weight. However, the legality of the confession became a central point of contention. During his questioning in Georgia, Cooey had not been read his Miranda rights. He had also not been provided with a lawyer, despite multiple requests. These procedural lapses raised serious concerns about whether his confession could be admitted in court. Defense attorneys argued that the confession was coerced and therefore inadmissible. The prosecution focused on building a case independent of the confession. The forensic evidence became the centerpiece. They emphasized the DNA matches, the physical evidence from the trailer, and the statements made by Cooey to multiple individuals, including corrections officers and a nurse, that mirrored his earlier confession. Witnesses who lived in the house near the trailer were interviewed again. They admitted that Cooey had acted suspiciously during the weeks Jessica was missing. One housemate stated that she had been told not to go near the back of the property. Another recalled seeing Cooey burn trash shortly after Jessica's disappearance. Despite their proximity to the crime, there was no indication that the other residents had knowledge of Jessica's presence or the crime itself. As public awareness of the case grew, pressure mounted on prosecutors to secure a conviction. The community's sense of betrayal was palpable. The Lunsford family, devastated by the details of Jessica's final days, pushed for the strongest possible punishment. Mark Lunsford continued to speak publicly, demanding justice and accountability. Meanwhile, Cooey was held in protective custody. Due to the high-profile nature of the case and the charges against him, there were concerns about his safety within the jail population. He was monitored closely, and arrangements were made for psychological evaluation to determine his competency to stand trial. The pre-trial phase dragged on, complicated by the legal wrangling over the confession and motions filed by the defense. The court ruled that portions of the confession, particularly those made after repeated requests for counsel, would be excluded. However, the prosecution remained confident. The weight of the physical evidence they believed would be more than sufficient. In the lead up to the trial, public interest remained intense. The community that had searched for Jessica now waited for closure through the legal system. The prosecution prepared to lay out a case that would show not only Cooey's guilt, but the failures that allowed him to remain under the radar. Investigators, having spent months reconstructing Jessica's final hours, were determined to present every detail with accuracy and respect. Their findings told a story of opportunity, negligence, and horror, but also of a methodical pursuit of truth. As the trial approached, the case was no longer just about one man's actions. It had become a reflection of systemic flaws, legal complexities, and the enduring impact of a single crime on an entire community. The legal case against John Coey, built upon weeks of investigation and evidence gathering, reached a pivotal moment as court proceedings moved toward trial. Central to the prosecution's strategy was Coey's confession, obtained while he was in custody in Savannah, Georgia. The recorded interview contained graphic admissions detailing how he had entered the Lunsford home, abducted Jessica, held her in his trailer, and eventually killed her. However, defense attorneys moved quickly to challenge the validity of that confession. Their argument centered on procedural violations. During his interrogation, Coey was not read his Miranda rights in a timely manner, and despite repeated requests, was not granted access to legal counsel. Over several hours of questioning, Coey appeared confused and disoriented. His mental capacity became a significant factor in the legal proceedings. Defense attorneys contended that he was not competent to understand the consequences of waiving his rights, and that any statements he made should be considered inadmissible. The court agreed in part. A ruling excluded key portions of Coey's confession from trial, particularly those obtained after he had requested an attorney. The court determined that his Sixth Amendment rights had been violated. This ruling dealt a blow to the prosecution's narrative, stripping them of what was initially seen as a clear and direct admission of guilt. However, prosecutors maintained confidence in their case. They shifted focus to the extensive forensic evidence. Jessica's fingerprints, DNA, and personal items had been found in Coey's trailer. Witness testimony from forensic experts confirmed that the remains found near Coey's home matched the location he described, and the circumstances of her death aligned with the timeline established through physical evidence. Additional testimony came from individuals Coey had spoken with after his arrest. While in jail, he had repeated elements of his confession to a jail nurse and corrections officers. These statements, made voluntarily and without coercion, were deemed admissible. They revealed consistent details with his earlier recorded confession. How he had entered the Lunsford home, concealed Jessica in the trailer, and ultimately buried her alive. In court, the prosecution presented these statements alongside photographic and forensic documentation from the trailer and burial site. They used crime scene photos, DNA analysis, and expert testimony to paint a meticulous picture of what had occurred. The defense, constrained by the overwhelming physical evidence, pivoted to Coey's mental state. They introduced testimony suggesting he had limited cognitive functioning and struggled with understanding complex situations. Psychiatrists described him as impaired, possibly unable to form the intent necessary for premeditated murder. Despite these efforts, the cumulative weight of the evidence left little doubt. Jurors heard how Jessica's abduction had gone unnoticed for hours, how she was hidden just a few yards from her home, and how the response from law enforcement was complicated by Cooey's failure to register as a sex offender. Witnesses from the neighborhood recalled Cooey acting suspiciously during the time Jessica was missing. One resident stated that Cooey had instructed others not to enter certain areas near the trailer. Public reaction to the proceedings was intense. Media coverage remained constant, and opinion was largely unsympathetic toward Cooey. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse during hearings. Jessica's family members attended each session, their presence a reminder of the case's emotional weight. Mark Lunsford, especially, became a symbol of a grieving parent turned advocate, pushing for tighter laws and increased oversight of sex offenders. Through weeks of hearings, arguments, and evidentiary reviews, the case inched toward conclusion. The legal challenges surrounding the confession underscored broader concerns about due process, but they did not alter the fundamental trajectory of the trial. The physical evidence, the corroborative statements, and the investigative timeline formed a coherent, devastating account. The defense rested, having laid out their case for diminished responsibility. The prosecution, in closing arguments, reminded the jury of Jessica's suffering and the deliberate acts that led to her death. The matter was then placed in the hands of the jury. They were asked to weigh not only the facts, but also the moral responsibility for a crime that had shaken a community to its core. On February 12, 2007, nearly 2 years after Jessica Lunsford's disappearance, the trial of John Evander Cooey commenced in Inverness, Florida. The courtroom was filled with reporters, attorneys, law enforcement officials, and members of the public who had followed the case closely. Jessica's family sat in the front row, bracing themselves for what they knew would be emotionally excruciating testimony. The prosecution laid out their case with a methodical clarity. Although portions of Cooey's confession had been excluded, the state relied on forensic evidence and statements he made to others after his arrest. Jurors were shown photographs from the crime scene, the trailer where Jessica was held, and the shallow grave where she was found. DNA experts testified that Jessica's genetic material had been recovered from items inside the trailer, including the bed Cooey slept on. A nurse who attended Cooey in jail testified that he voluntarily discussed aspects of the crime. She described his demeanor as calm, and his recounting of the events consistent with other evidence. Corrections officers provided similar testimony, recounting conversations in which Cooey admitted to taking Jessica and burying her alive. These accounts helped to bolster the prosecution's narrative in the absence of a fully admissible confession. The defense team sought to counter the prosecution with arguments rooted in Cooey's mental state. They called expert witnesses to testify that Cooey had an IQ below average, suffered from learning disabilities, and was unable to fully comprehend his actions. The defense argued that his intellectual impairments made him vulnerable during interrogations and may have influenced his behavior. Despite these efforts, the evidence was substantial. Prosecutors detailed the timeline, how Jessica was taken from her bedroom, how she was held for days in a closet within the trailer, and how she was ultimately buried alive. Jurors heard how Cooey had been living just a few doors down from the Lunsford home, in a trailer that had not been searched during the initial days of the investigation. The emotional weight of the trial was visible. Jurors often looked away during graphic testimony. Jessica's family remained composed, though visibly affected. The community followed every development, many expressing disbelief that such a crime could have occurred so close to home. After weeks of testimony and closing arguments, the case was handed to the jury. Deliberations began on March 7, 2007. It took the jury just over 4 hours to reach a verdict. On March the 7th, Cooey was found guilty on all counts. first-degree murder, kidnapping, sexual battery on a child under 12, and burglary. The verdict was read aloud in a silent courtroom. Mark Lunsford lowered his head and wept. Outside the courthouse, supporters of the Lunsford family embraced and cheered. The trial had ended, but the sentencing phase remained. During sentencing hearings, the prosecution presented aggravating factors to support a death penalty recommendation. They emphasized the premeditated nature of the crime, the vulnerability of the victim, and the prolonged suffering she endured. The defense countered with mitigating evidence related to Coey's mental health and upbringing. On March 14, 2007, the jury recommended the death penalty by a vote of 10-2. The judge accepted the recommendation, formally sentencing John Coey to death. In addition to the death sentence, Coey received life terms for sexual battery and kidnapping, and additional years for burglary. The sentencing brought a sense of closure to some, but for Jessica's family, it marked a solemn milestone rather than relief. The legal system had spoken, but the loss remained irrevocable. In interviews, Mark Lunsford acknowledged the verdict as justice, but continued to advocate for changes in how sex offenders are monitored and prosecuted. Coey was transferred to death row at Union Correctional Institution in Florida. However, his time there would be brief. Before any appeals could be fully processed, Coey died on September 30, 2009, of natural causes related to cancer. The conclusion of the trial did not erase the questions left in its wake about system failures, missed opportunities, and the challenges of enforcing laws intended to protect children. But it did mark the end of one chapter in a case that had deeply affected a community and captured national attention. Jessica Lunsford's death prompted more than sorrow. It ignited a legislative response that would change how the United States monitored convicted sex offenders. As the horrific details of the case became widely known, lawmakers across Florida and beyond moved swiftly to address the gaps in the system that allowed John Coey, a known offender, to live unmonitored near a child without alerting authorities. Just months after Jessica's death, Florida lawmakers introduced and passed the Jessica Lunsford Act. The legislation, signed into law in 2005, imposed strict new requirements on sex offenders, particularly those who had committed crimes against children under the age of 12. Under the Act, any adult convicted of lewd or lascivious battery or molestation involving a child would face a mandatory minimum sentence of 25 years to life in prison. Upon release, they would be subject to lifetime electronic monitoring using GPS technology. The law also expanded registration requirements, mandated more frequent address verification, and placed limitations on where sex offenders could live. Schools and child care facilities became key zones around which residency restrictions applied. This legislative package reflected a direct response to the failures identified in the Coey case. Chief among them, his ability to remain undetected in a residential neighborhood. The act passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. State legislators praised the Lunsford family for their advocacy, especially Mark Lunsford, who worked closely with officials to push for reforms. His public appearances and meetings with lawmakers kept national attention on the case and helped build momentum for swift passage. Other states followed Florida's lead. Within 2 years, more than 40 states had introduced or enacted similar measures, often named after Jessica. These laws varied in scope, but typically included harsher penalties for child sex crimes and increased post-release supervision. The term Jessica's Law became a rallying point for child safety advocates and legislators aiming to fortify the legal framework protecting minors from sexual predators. At the federal level, the case influenced broader initiatives as well. Elements of Jessica's law were echoed in federal statutes and funding guidelines, encouraging states to comply with new standards or risk losing public safety grants. Electronic monitoring, once used sparingly, became more widespread as GPS tracking technology improved. Critics of the legislation voiced concerns over unintended consequences. Some argued that mandatory minimums removed judicial discretion, leading to disproportionately long sentences in cases with mitigating factors. Others noted that strict residency restrictions forced many offenders into homelessness or rural isolation, complicating efforts to monitor them effectively. Nonetheless, public support for the laws remained high, driven by the emotional impact of Jessica's case. In addition to legal reforms, Jessica's story reshaped public discourse about child safety. Parents became more vigilant. Schools implemented tighter security protocols, and communities demanded more transparency about offenders living nearby. Law enforcement agencies received increased funding for offender tracking systems and public alert infrastructure. The case also highlighted lapses in communication between jurisdictions. Coe had failed to register as a sex offender in Florida, and local authorities lacked an effective mechanism for tracking transient offenders who moved frequently or lived with family. The Jessica Lunsford Act mandated tighter coordination between state and local agencies, as well as real-time data sharing to close these critical gaps. Mark Lunsford continued to travel the country, meeting with other families, speaking at conferences, and testifying before legislatures. He turned personal tragedy into a nationwide campaign, calling for reforms not only in law, but in how communities protect their most vulnerable members. His advocacy helped maintain the momentum behind the reforms and ensured that Jessica's memory served as a catalyst for enduring change. Though legislation could not undo the crime or erase the pain it caused, the measures it inspired stood as a tribute to Jessica's life. They aimed to prevent future tragedies and to create a legal environment in which children could be better shielded from known dangers. The passage of these laws signaled a shift from reactive policing to proactive prevention. Jessica's name became synonymous not just with tragedy, but with a legacy of protection and vigilance. In the years following Jessica Lunsford's death, the community of Homosassa worked to heal. Though the crime had forever changed the landscape of the town, efforts to preserve Jessica's memory became a central focus for her family, friends, and supporters. Out of loss, a movement to honor her spirit and safeguard other children emerged. Mark Lunsford remained at the forefront of this effort. He founded the Jessica Marie Lunsford Foundation to raise awareness about child safety and support families affected by similar tragedies. Through public speaking engagements, media appearances, and legislative advocacy, he continued to share Jessica's story, reinforcing the urgent need for vigilance and reform. One of the most enduring legacies of Jessica's life was the creation of Jessie's Place, a child advocacy center named in her honor. Located in Citrus County, Jessie's Place was designed to provide a safe, child-friendly environment for victims of abuse to receive counseling, medical care, and support during investigations. The center brought together law enforcement, social services, and healthcare providers under one roof, streamlining the process and reducing trauma for young victims. The facility's walls are adorned with images and artwork that reflect Jessica's personality. Bright colors, butterflies, and elements inspired by her love of singing and drawing. Her memory lives not only in the building's mission, but in the gentle spaces created to comfort children in crisis. Schools across the state of Florida and beyond incorporated Jessica's story into safety education programs. Classroom lessons on stranger danger emergency preparedness, and how to seek help became more prevalent. Her case served as a stark reminder of how quickly danger could arise, even in the familiarity of one's home. The annual Walk for Jessica became a tradition in Homosassa and neighboring communities. Participants wore purple, her favorite color, and walked in remembrance, raising funds for child protection initiatives. The walk brought together families, officials, and children from all walks of life, united by a common goal: to ensure that what happened to Jessica would not happen again. Jessica's classmates, who had once shared school hallways and playgrounds with her, grew up carrying her memory. Many of them participated in awareness campaigns and continued to support local child advocacy events. Her teachers and counselors remembered her as a joyful presence, a child who brought energy into every room. The broader national impact of her story remained visible as well. Law enforcement agencies refined their approach to missing children cases. Response protocols were updated to prioritize early searches of high-risk areas, including residences of known offenders. New databases and monitoring systems were developed to track compliance with registration laws more efficiently. Jessica's case also became a point of reference in criminal justice training. Detectives, prosecutors, and child welfare workers studied the timeline, the investigative choices, and the eventual breakthroughs. It became an instructive example of how delays, oversights, and assumptions could cost precious time and lives. Despite the reforms and tributes, the Lunsford family continued to feel the weight of their loss. Jessica's absence was a permanent void. Yet, in the ways she was remembered and in the protections her case inspired, her life held meaning beyond the tragedy. In interviews years later, Mark Lunsford often described Jessica not by the circumstances of her death, but by the qualities that made her unique. A child who loved to perform, who made everyone around her smile, who hugged tightly and never left without saying, "I love you." His public persona as an advocate was inseparable from his private role as a grieving father, and both fueled his mission to ensure her story would endure. Today, Jessica Lunsford is remembered not only in law books and legislation, but in classrooms, advocacy centers, and family living rooms. Her story continues to serve as a warning and a call to action, one that asks communities to be vigilant, legal systems to be accountable, and all people to protect the innocent. Her legacy is not just what happened to her, but what was built in her name. Through memory, through advocacy, and through the many lives touched by the protections she inspired, Jessica remains a part of the world she left behind. Lassie Denise Rocha was born on May 4, 1975, in Modesto, California. Raised in a close-knit family, she was known for her warm personality and strong family values. She attended California Polytechnic State University, where she majored in ornamental horticulture. It was during her college years that she met Scott Lee Peterson, a charming, clean-cut fellow student who shared her ambition and calm demeanor. The couple began dating seriously and married in August 1997. The newlyweds settled in Modesto, where Scott found work as a fertilizer salesman, and Lassie worked part-time while planning to become a full-time homemaker. They purchased a small bungalow on Covina Avenue in a quiet neighborhood. By late 2002, the Petersons were preparing to welcome their first child, a boy they planned to name Connor. Lacey, 8 months pregnant, was excitedly preparing for Christmas, decorating their home and baking cookies for the holiday season. Neighbors and friends viewed them as an ideal couple. Lacey was outgoing and enthusiastic, while Scott appeared supportive and attentive. Photos from the period show them smiling at family gatherings and preparing the nursery. As the holidays approached, Lacey stayed active despite her pregnancy, attending a Christmas party on December 14th and shopping for last-minute gifts. She spoke with her mother, Sharon Rocha, regularly, maintaining her close bond with her family. On December 23rd, Lacey visited a salon owned by her sister, Amy Rocha, to get her hair done. She mentioned her plans for Christmas Eve, baking, walking the dog, and preparing for dinner. That night, she and Scott watched television together. By all appearances, it was a calm, ordinary evening in a peaceful suburban life. Yet, within hours, everything would change. Lacey Peterson would vanish, setting off a case that would captivate the nation and raise enduring questions about appearances, trust, and justice. On the morning of December 24th, 2002, the Peterson household on Covina Avenue was quiet. Scott Peterson later recounted that he saw Lacey around 9:30 a.m. She was dressed in black pants and a white shirt, preparing for a busy day of errands. According to Scott, she planned to take their golden retriever, Mackenzie, for a walk in the park, then go grocery shopping for Christmas dinner. Scott stated that he left the house around the same time, heading to the Berkeley Marina to fish alone on his small aluminum boat. His account placed him in San Francisco Bay for several hours. He claimed to have returned home that afternoon to find Lacey gone and the dog in the backyard, leash still attached. The house was undisturbed, but Lacey's purse, keys, and phone were inside. By early evening, concern began to build. Lacey's stepfather, Ron Gransky, and her mother, Sharon Rocha, were contacted. Friends and family began calling hospitals, assuming something might have gone wrong during her errands. No one had seen her since the morning. That evening, Sharon reported Lacey missing to the Modesto Police Department. Initial police response treated the matter as a missing person case. Given Lacey's late-stage pregnancy and the holiday, her disappearance was alarming. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, speaking with neighbors and checking local parks. Several neighbors recalled seeing the couple's dog roaming alone that morning, but no one reported seeing Lacey herself. The first hours were critical. Modesto police searched the Peterson home that night, finding nothing overtly suspicious. They noted the spotless condition of the house. Scott cooperated with investigators, providing details of his whereabouts and allowing a cursory search of the property. Volunteers and family members quickly mobilized. Flyers with Lacey's photograph and a description of her clothing circulated across Modesto. News of a missing pregnant woman began to make headlines. Police asked Scott to sit for interviews and participate in searches. Yet from the start, some investigators harbored quiet doubts. Scott's alibi involved a solitary fishing trip on Christmas Eve, an unusual choice under the circumstances. Officers visited the Berkeley Marina to confirm his story and found a parking receipt from the lot, verifying his presence. However, questions began to emerge about his demeanor and timeline. The Modesto community responded swiftly. Friends, neighbors, and strangers offered support, combing parks, neighborhoods, and rural areas for any sign of Lacey. Volunteers staffed phone banks and organized daily search parties. The family held press conferences, pleading for information. Sharon Rocha appeared emotionally devastated but composed, urging the public to help bring her daughter home. As night fell on December 24th, the Peterson family was divided between anxiety and disbelief. There were no signs of a struggle, no witnesses, and no clear answers. The life Lacey had carefully built was suddenly suspended in uncertainty, and a search that would span months had just begun. In the days following Lacey Peterson's disappearance, Modesto transformed into the epicenter of a growing search operation. Volunteers streamed into town, many coordinated through a command center established at a local Red Lion hotel. Hundreds combed fields, waterways, and neighborhoods, while helicopters scanned the area from above. Billboards displayed Lacey's photo and a description of her last known outfit. Media coverage intensified rapidly, capturing national attention. Scott Peterson was initially seen as a supportive husband. He appeared at the search center, distributed flyers, and gave brief statements to the press. He remained calm during interviews, which some interpreted as composure, while others viewed with suspicion. Law enforcement began a more intensive investigation, taking steps to verify Scott's movements on December 24th. They examined phone records, traffic camera footage, and confirmed that Scott had launched his boat at the Berkeley Marina that day. However, inconsistencies in his narrative emerged over time. As detectives reviewed Scott's alibi, they grew concerned over his lack of emotion and reluctance to engage with police beyond surface cooperation. He declined a polygraph test and hired an attorney early in the investigation, which, while legal and prudent, raised eyebrows. The public began questioning his role, and the media's portrayal shifted. A break in perception occurred when police monitoring Scott's communications uncovered that he had been in a relationship with another woman at the time of Lacey's disappearance. This revelation added a new dimension to the case. Although Scott initially denied infidelity, the woman, Amber Frey, would soon come forward. She had no idea Scott was married, let alone that his wife was missing. Authorities began recording their conversations, hoping for incriminating statements. Meanwhile, the search for Lacey continued without success. Divers scoured reservoirs and rivers, while cadaver dogs were used in parks and open fields. Investigators focused increasingly on the San Francisco Bay, particularly the area near the marina where Scott had gone fishing. Currents and tides complicated any effort to locate potential evidence. Lacey's family grew more vocal and emotional. Sharon Rocha and Ron Gransky made regular appeals to the public, describing Lacey's personality and emphasizing her excitement about motherhood. Candlelight vigils were held in Modesto, drawing crowds of supporters and media crews. The community, once united in hope, began expressing frustration as weeks passed without results. Despite the tireless efforts, no trace of Lacey or her unborn son emerged during this early period. Winter rains and dense terrain hindered progress. Police released few details, but behind the scenes, they were building a case and closely tracking Scott's behavior. The image of a missing wife and grieving husband had begun to shift in public perception. Investigators moved quietly but deliberately, balancing the need for evidence with growing pressure for answers. As January turned to February, the case remained unsolved, but the investigation was deepening. As the investigation entered its second month, the Modesto Police Department expanded its resources and coordination with federal agencies. The FBI and California Department of Justice assisted in data analysis, while forensic teams revisited every aspect of Scott Peterson's timeline. Investigators focused intently on his phone records, internet searches, and the route he claimed to have taken on December 24th. Attention increasingly centered on Scott's relationship with Amber Frey. In early January 2003, Amber held a press conference, accompanied by her attorney, confirming that she had been in a romantic relationship with Scott, unaware that he was married or that Lacey was missing. This announcement dramatically altered public sentiment. Amber had cooperated with police since being contacted, allowing them to record her phone conversations with Scott over several weeks. These calls, recorded after Lacey disappeared, revealed that Scott continued to mislead Amber. He never acknowledged his wife's disappearance until it became publicly unavoidable. In a call dated December 31st, he told her he was in Paris celebrating the new year, while in reality, he was at Lassie's vigil in Modesto. These fabrications became crucial in shaping the case against him. Detectives re-examined Scott's actions in the days after Lacey vanished. He sold Lacey's vehicle and inquired about selling their home. He also traded in her life insurance policy. Investigators began constructing a narrative centered on motive, financial pressure, the burden of impending fatherhood, and a desire for freedom that might have led to murder. Search efforts persisted throughout this phase. Teams returned repeatedly to the Berkeley Marina. Oceanographers were consulted to model tidal patterns in San Francisco Bay, attempting to predict where a body disposed of in the water might surface. The currents were strong and unpredictable, but the location of Scott's fishing trip was now considered the likely site of foul play. Investigators also scrutinized Scott's boat. Forensic examination revealed a homemade anchor and trace materials that did not conclusively link to Lacey, but raised questions about the vessel's use. Experts testified that the boat could be used to discreetly dump a weighted object. Surveillance showed that Scott purchased cement around the time of Lacey's disappearance and had created several homemade anchors, only one of which was recovered. The public followed the developments closely. Television networks aired nightly updates. Lacey's smiling face became a national symbol of a young woman stolen from a promising life. Public pressure mounted, and theories about Scott's involvement dominated discussion. Yet through all this, no direct physical evidence of Lacey's fate had emerged. Without a body, prosecutors knew a case based solely on circumstantial evidence would be challenging. Still, they pressed forward, confident that the mounting contradictions in Scott's behavior and the strength of circumstantial links would support a prosecution. By early spring, law enforcement awaited a pivotal moment. They continued surveillance of Scott, now considered their prime suspect. They knew that if a body surfaced, it might provide the forensic link needed to file charges. That moment would arrive soon, bringing the investigation to a turning point. On April 13, 2003, a couple walking along the shore of the San Francisco Bay near the Richmond area discovered the decomposed body of a small infant. The next day, less than a mile away, a second body was found, this time a woman's torso, missing the head, hands, and feet. The location was within proximity to the Berkeley Marina, where Scott Peterson had said he went fishing on December 24th. Authorities quickly secured the area and transported the remains for forensic examination. DNA testing was conducted on both bodies. On April 18th, it was confirmed. The woman was Lacey Peterson, and the infant was her son, Connor. Lacey had been identified through dental records. The exact cause of death could not be determined due to the advanced state of decomposition, but the condition of the remains suggested that the bodies had been in the water for months. The discovery shifted the case from a missing person investigation to a homicide. Modesto police, who have been monitoring Scott closely for weeks, acted immediately. On April 18, 2003, the same day the identities were confirmed, Scott was arrested in La Jolla, San Diego County. He was carrying $15,000 in cash, 4 cell phones, his brother's driver's license, camping gear, a gun, and multiple changes of clothing. His naturally dark hair had been lightened blonde. Investigators viewed these items as indicative of flight. Scott was charged with 2 counts of murder, 1 for Lacey and 1 for Connor. The charges included special circumstances that made the case eligible for the death penalty. Prosecutors alleged premeditation and argued that Scott had killed his wife and unborn child, then disposed of their bodies in the bay. The presence of the baby outside of Lacey's body led to additional legal scrutiny, emphasizing California's laws on fetal homicide. In Modesto, the arrest was met with mixed emotions, relief that there had been a development, but deep sorrow for the confirmed deaths. Lacey's family expressed gratitude for the support they had received and the work of investigators, but their public appearances reflected the anguish of their loss. Vigils that had once been hopeful gatherings turned somber. The case drew further national attention. Reporters flooded Modesto and San Diego. The arrest details, particularly Scott's apparent preparations to flee and his physical transformation, fueled media speculation. The prosecution began outlining its case to the public, emphasizing Scott's infidelity, his shifting alibi, and the circumstantial evidence connecting him to the disposal site. Scott was held without bail and arraigned days later. He pleaded not guilty to both charges. His defense team began preparations for what was expected to be a long, high-profile trial. As pre-trial hearings began, motions were filed to challenge the admissibility of evidence, and questions about media bias and jury impartiality loomed. With Lacey and Connor's remains recovered, the search had ended, but the pursuit of justice had entered a new phase. The investigation now moved into the courtroom, where prosecutors would attempt to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Scott Peterson had orchestrated a double homicide under the guise of an ordinary December morning. Scott Peterson's trial was one of the most widely watched in modern American history. The high-profile nature of the case, compounded by intense media coverage, prompted the court to move the trial from Stanislaus County to San Mateo County in order to ensure a fair and impartial jury. Jury selection began in early 2004, drawing from a large pool of candidates screened extensively for bias due to pre-trial publicity. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Rick DiStasso, sought the death penalty. They laid out a theory of calculated murder. Scott, they contended, had killed Lacey in their home, transported her body to the Berkeley Marina, and disposed of it in the bay under the cover of a solo fishing trip. Prosecutors highlighted the timing of Lacey's disappearance, Scott's affair with Amber Frey, and his behavior following the incident as key circumstantial evidence. Opening statements began in June 2004. The prosecution painted a picture of a man leading a double life, appearing to be a devoted husband while hiding an affair and financial pressures. They emphasized that Scott had told Amber he was a widower before Lacey had vanished, framing this as premeditation. The state presented the affair as central to motive. Scott, they claimed, wanted freedom from fatherhood and marriage without facing the fallout of divorce. The defense, led by attorney Mark Geragos, countered by arguing that the evidence was entirely circumstantial and that no direct physical proof linked Scott to the murder. They acknowledged the affair, but insisted it did not equate to homicide. Geragos posited that the media's portrayal had unfairly biased the public, and that law enforcement had focused too narrowly on Scott, ignoring other potential leads. During the trial, prosecutors brought in dozens of witnesses, including police officers, forensic experts, and friends of the Petersons. One of the most impactful was Amber Frey, who testified in detail about her relationship with Scott and her cooperation with police. Audio recordings of her phone calls with Scott were played in court, capturing his deception and detachment from the events unfolding in Modesto. Forensic testimony addressed the condition of Lacey and Connor's remains, though the cause of death could not be definitively established. Experts spoke about ocean currents and how the bodies could have drifted from the suspected disposal site near the marina. Additional testimony addressed the cement anchor found in Scott's boat and his purchase of materials to make several such weights. the defense sought to raise doubt about the integrity of the investigation. They suggested that media pressure had led to tunnel vision and that alternate suspects had not been pursued. They questioned whether Lacey could have been abducted during her walk and presented witnesses who claimed to have seen her alive after the morning of December 24th. Despite the absence of direct evidence, no witnesses to a crime, no murder weapon, no definitive cause of death, the prosecution leaned heavily on the consistency of their circumstantial case. The jury listened for months as both sides presented complex arguments in a case with emotional weight and national significance. By the time closing arguments approached, the public's attention was riveted. Satellite trucks remained parked outside the courthouse, and nightly news segments dissected every development. Inside the courtroom, the jurors prepared to deliberate on charges that could lead to a death sentence, in a trial where emotion and evidence were closely entwined. As the prosecution advanced its arguments, it focused on constructing a cohesive timeline to contradict Scott Peterson's account of December 24th, 2002. The state's case depended heavily on showing that Scott's version of events was implausible and inconsistent with the physical and circumstantial evidence uncovered during the investigation. Prosecutors reconstructed Scott's movements from phone records, surveillance footage, and digital forensics. They emphasized the unusual nature of a fishing trip taken on Christmas Eve, particularly by someone whose wife was 8 months pregnant. They noted that Scott had purchased a new boat shortly before Lacey's disappearance and had not told anyone about it, a fact seen as suspicious by investigators. Attention also centered on the homemade anchors. Testimony revealed that Scott had bought bags of cement in early December and used them to make multiple anchors. Only one was recovered. The prosecution posited that additional anchors had been used to weigh down Lacey's body. Though no residue or traces could definitively link the cement to the remains, the missing anchors were presented as part of a calculated effort to conceal a crime. Key forensic testimony examined the decomposition patterns and oceanographic data related to the San Francisco Bay. Experts explained that the location where Lacey and Connor were found was consistent with the drift patterns from the Berkeley Marina. Though the exact path could not be determined, the likelihood that bodies had been dumped in that area and later surfaced nearby added weight to the prosecution's narrative. Another focus was Scott's behavior in the aftermath of Lacey's disappearance. Witnesses testified to his seeming lack of emotion and willingness to engage in media interviews, during which his statements sometimes contradicted earlier ones. His decision to sell Lacey's car, inquire about selling their home, and continue seeing Amber Frey while claiming to search for his wife were highlighted as indicative of detachment and motive. The recorded calls between Scott and Amber Frey continued to play a critical role. In court, jurors heard Scott describe a fictional trip to Europe while participating in a candlelight vigil for Lacey. His words conveyed a calculated dishonesty that undermined his credibility. Prosecutors argued that these lies were not just to preserve a relationship, but evidence of a man who had already enacted a plan to eliminate his wife. Prosecutors also addressed Scott's apparent lack of concern when Lacey was initially reported missing. Law enforcement officers and family members described his demeanor as strangely calm. In contrast, Lacey's family testified to their anguish and confusion, contrasting Scott's reactions with their own desperation. Throughout the trial, the prosecution's strategy was to reinforce the consistency of their theory. Motive born from infidelity and disinterest in fatherhood. Preparation through secret boat purchases and cement anchors. Execution under the cover of a fishing trip. And concealment by dumping the body in a location that delayed discovery. each point built upon the others, crafting a narrative of premeditated murder. By late October 2004, the state had concluded its case. The jury had heard weeks of testimony, seen dozens of exhibits, and been exposed to hours of audio recordings. While no single piece of evidence conclusively proved Scott Peterson's guilt, the cumulative weight of the circumstantial case was substantial. The defense would soon present its counter-arguments, seeking to dismantle the structure carefully built over months of testimony. With the prosecution resting its case, Scott Peterson's defense team took the floor. Led by Mark Garagos, the defense adopted a strategy centered on doubt. They maintained that no direct evidence linked Scott to Laci's death, and argued that the prosecution had constructed a narrative without proving its key assertions. The defense sought to deconstruct the circumstantial case, point by point. Garagos began by challenging the timeline. He pointed to neighbors who claimed to have seen Laci walking the dog after the time Scott said he left for the marina. These sightings, though not independently verified, were intended to undermine the assertion that Laci was killed in the home that morning. The defense argued that these witness statements introduced reasonable doubt about when Laci vanished, and thus about Scott's opportunity to commit the crime. The boat, another cornerstone of the prosecution's theory, was also addressed. The defense called witnesses to testify that the boat was unstable and not suitable for dumping a body without significant risk. They argued that if Scott had committed such an act in broad daylight at a public marina, someone would likely have noticed. Furthermore, they noted the absence of blood or DNA in the boat or truck. Regarding the homemade anchors, the defense acknowledged that Scott had made one, but questioned the leap from that fact to a conclusion of murder. They emphasized that no physical evidence connected the anchors to Laci's body. The idea that Scott had made additional anchors and used them to weigh down Laci and Connor was, they argued, speculative. Much of the defense's argument focused on the lack of forensic evidence. No fingerprints, hair, or fibers tied Scott directly to the crime. The home showed no signs of struggle, and the autopsy could not determine how Laci died. Garagos reminded jurors that a murder conviction required proof beyond reasonable doubt, and in this case, that standard had not been met. Amber Frey's testimony was addressed carefully. The defense admitted the affair was damaging, but argued it was not proof of murder. Garagos sought to separate personal betrayal from criminal behavior, suggesting that Scott's lies were about avoiding embarrassment, not evidence of guilt. He framed the recordings as those of a man trying to juggle two lives, not someone orchestrating homicide. The defense also introduced alternate theories. They referenced potential burglaries in the Peterson neighborhood around the time of Laci's disappearance. Though these suggestions lack solid evidence, they were intended to raise questions about whether other suspects had been adequately pursued. Garagos criticized the police investigation as narrowly focused. He pointed to missed leads and argued that public pressure had led law enforcement to lock onto Scott prematurely. The media's influence on the perception of guilt, he contended, created a biased environment that had infiltrated even the courtroom. As the defense rested, they left jurors with a clear message. The case was built on suspicion, not certainty. The prosecution had offered a plausible story, but plausibility was not enough for conviction. They urged the jury to examine the lack of physical evidence, the reliability of witness statements, and the possibility of alternative explanations. The trial had spanned months. With both sides having presented their cases, the fate of Scott Peterson would now rest, with 12 jurors tasked with weighing a complex mix of facts, inferences, and emotions. The legal battle was nearing its conclusion, but its resolution would depend on how the jurors interpreted what they had seen and heard. By early November 2004, closing arguments were delivered. The prosecution reiterated its case: a marriage strained by infidelity, a husband who lied repeatedly, and a calculated plan to eliminate a wife and unborn child. They stressed the convergence of motive, opportunity, and behavior. The defense, in contrast, urged the jury to focus on the gaps: the lack of physical evidence, the reliance on circumstantial claims, and the possibility of reasonable doubt. The jury deliberated for over a week. Their task was to determine whether Scott Peterson was guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Laci Peterson and second-degree murder in the death of their unborn son, Connor. The deliberations were marked by tension. At one point, a juror was dismissed and replaced after a dispute. The court warned the media not to speculate, but public anticipation grew as the jury neared a decision. On November 12, 2004, the verdict was read. Scott Peterson was found guilty of both charges. The courtroom was silent as the words were spoken. Members of Laci's family embraced, some weeping. Scott remained impassive, staring straight ahead. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, and many erupted into cheers. The case, so closely followed for nearly 2 years, had reached a turning point. The sentencing phase followed. Jurors now had to decide whether Scott would receive life imprisonment or the death penalty. The prosecution called witnesses to describe the emotional devastation felt by Laci's family. Sharon Rocha, in powerful testimony, spoke of her daughter's joy at becoming a mother, her loving nature, and the pain of losing both daughter and grandson. The defense, hoping to avoid capital punishment, presented mitigating factors. They emphasized Scott's lack of criminal history and portrayed him as a man who could contribute positively to prison life if spared the death penalty. They urged the jury to show mercy. After further deliberations, the jury returned with its decision. On December 13, 2004, they recommended the death penalty for Scott Peterson. One juror, when asked later, cited Scott's demeanor and dishonesty as key factors influencing the decision. The sentencing was formalized by the judge in March 2005. Scott Peterson was sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he would await execution on death row. In the courtroom and across the nation, reactions were divided. Many saw justice served, while others questioned whether the evidence justified such a sentence. Legal experts debated the implications, particularly regarding reliance on circumstantial evidence in capital cases. For Laci's family, the verdict offered a form of closure, though not peace. They had endured months of uncertainty, emotional testimony, and public scrutiny. Their focus turned to honoring Laci's memory through advocacy and support for other families of missing persons. Scott Peterson was housed in a single cell, subject to the isolation common for death row inmates. His legal team began the appeals process almost immediately, arguing procedural errors and bias in the trial. The case continued to evolve in legal and public arenas, but the trial itself had concluded, marking the end of one of the most watched criminal proceedings of its time. Following his sentencing, Scott Peterson was transferred to San Quentin State Prison's death row. The conclusion of the trial did not bring an end to the legal proceedings. Almost immediately, Peterson's legal team initiated the appeals process, challenging various aspects of the trial, including jury selection, media influence, and evidentiary rulings. In the years after the conviction, the case continued to draw attention. Legal analysts scrutinized the reliance on circumstantial evidence in securing a death sentence. Advocates on both sides debated whether the trial had been fair, especially in a media environment that saturated public opinion from the outset. One of the most significant developments occurred in 2020 when the California Supreme Court overturned Peterson's death sentence. The court ruled that the trial judge had made errors in jury selection, specifically by dismissing prospective jurors who expressed general objections to the death penalty without determining whether those views would impair their ability to follow the law. However, the court upheld his convictions for the murders of Lacey and Connor Peterson. The ruling did not exonerate Peterson, but opened the door for a re-examination of his sentence. In 2021, he was officially sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The hearing, held remotely due to pandemic restrictions, included statements from Lacey's family. Sharon Rocha addressed the court again, expressing continued pain over the loss and reaffirming her belief in Scott's guilt. Simultaneously, Peterson's defense pursued a new trial based on claims of juror misconduct. A juror had failed to disclose her prior involvement in a restraining order case, which the defense argued could have impacted her impartiality. In 2022, a judge held a multi-day hearing to examine the matter, hearing testimony from the juror and others involved in jury selection. The court eventually denied the request for a new trial, concluding that the omission had not materially affected the verdict. Beyond the courtroom, the case left lasting impacts. Public interest in missing persons surged in the early 2000s, and Lacey's story became a reference point for national media coverage. Her family established foundations and advocacy efforts to assist in searches for other missing individuals. Her name became emblematic of a tragic loss and a public movement for greater awareness. Scott Peterson remains incarcerated, with ongoing legal efforts to overturn his conviction. His defense team has continued to argue that the trial was flawed by pretrial publicity and judicial errors. The prosecution has maintained that the evidence was compelling and the verdict justified. Decades after Lacey Peterson disappeared from her Modesto home, her case remains a focal point in discussions of criminal justice, media influence, and capital punishment. The legal battle may continue, but for many, the verdict and its consequences represent the final chapter in a story marked by loss, scrutiny, and the enduring quest for justice. Amber Renee Hagerman was born on November 25, 1986, in Arlington, Texas, a mid-sized city nestled between Dallas and Fort Worth. At 9 years old, she was a spirited and lively child, known for her curiosity and strong will. Amber lived with her mother, Donna Whitson, and her 5-year-old brother, Ricky. She loved school, playing with her dolls, and riding her pink bicycle. Her family described her as outgoing and determined, a little girl who smiled easily and made friends quickly. On January 13, 1996, a Saturday, the weather in Arlington was unseasonably warm for mid-January, hovering in the 60s. The sun was shining, and families across the neighborhood were enjoying the brief respite from winter's chill. For the Whitson family, it was a day like any other. Amber and Ricky were at their grandparents' house, just a few blocks from their own home. The children had asked if they could ride their bikes. After getting approval, they set off with clear instructions from their mother: stay close, don't go far, and be back soon. Amber and Ricky rode toward an abandoned Winn-Dixie grocery store, located on Abrams Street. It was a familiar spot, just a short ride away, and one where Amber had ridden before. The parking lot was quiet, the store long closed, and it provided ample space for kids to ride without traffic. Around 3:10 p.m., the two children pedaled into the lot, but Ricky soon turned back, heading home, while Amber stayed behind to enjoy a few more moments on her bike. It was a decision that would change everything. Unbeknownst to Amber, she was being watched. A 78-year-old local resident named Jim Kevill, who lived across the street, sat on his front porch. From his vantage point, he saw a black pickup truck pull into the parking lot and stop near Amber. A man emerged from the vehicle and, without warning, grabbed her off her bike. Kevel would later recount that Amber screamed and kicked, resisting fiercely. The man shoved her into the cab of the truck and sped off, leaving behind her bicycle, lying on its side. The entire ordeal took less than a minute. Kevel, startled and horrified, immediately called 911. The call triggered a rapid response from the Arlington Police Department. Officers arrived at the scene within minutes. The pink bicycle was still there. There was no sign of Amber or the truck. A description was quickly broadcast. A man in a black or dark-colored pickup, possibly a full-size Ford, short bed, with a single cab. No license plate number had been seen. Back at the grandparents' house, Donna Whitson was told that Amber had not returned with Ricky. Panic began to set in. When police confirmed the abduction, Donna's fear turned to devastation. Her daughter had vanished in broad daylight, taken from a public place in front of a witness, yet already beyond reach. As news of the abduction spread, neighbors began to gather. Some tried to comfort the family, while others joined police in canvassing the area. Volunteers combed alleyways and fields, hoping for any clue. The abandoned store, once a mundane relic of suburbia, became a grim landmark. Amber's family could do little more than wait, clinging to hope as hours passed. The community that had seemed peaceful just hours earlier now pulsed with urgency and dread. Police officers worked through the night, chasing leads, collecting statements, and setting up a command center. The sun had set on Arlington, and with it, a sense of safety had slipped away. In that single sudden act, an ordinary Saturday had turned into a nightmare. The city of Arlington would never forget January 13th, 1996. The day Amber Hagerman disappeared from a parking lot under the open sky. The abduction of Amber Hagerman occurred in a matter of seconds, yet it would leave a lasting scar on a community and an unanswered question that lingers to this day. Who took her and why? It was approximately 3:10 p.m. when Amber, after arriving at the abandoned Winn-Dixie parking lot with her younger brother Ricky, chose to stay behind and ride a bit longer. Ricky, mindful of their mother's instructions, decided to head back to their grandparents' home. He expected Amber to follow soon after. Instead, as he rode off, a black pickup truck pulled into the lot. From across the street, Jim Kevel had a clear view of the lot from his backyard. Sitting just feet away from his fence, he noticed the unusual movement. A man got out of the truck and approached Amber quickly. Kevel later described the act as swift and violent. The man grabbed Amber and dragged her into the truck. She kicked and screamed, her voice carrying across the empty lot. Kevel could hear her. He saw her fighting. The man shoved her into the vehicle, slammed the door, and drove off heading west on Abram Street. Kevel, shaken, called 911 immediately. The time was approximately 3:11 p.m. Police units were dispatched to the scene at once. The first responders arrived within minutes. They found Amber's pink bike lying in the lot, untouched. There were no witnesses besides Kevel. No other surveillance cameras had captured the event. No one had managed to get a license plate number. The pickup had vanished as suddenly as it had arrived. Amber's mother, Donna, was still unaware of the incident when police arrived to question the family. The realization hit hard when Ricky, confused and scared, confirmed that Amber had not returned. Donna's panic intensified as she followed the officers to the scene, where the bike remained in place, a silent witness to the abduction. The manhunt began with urgency. Detectives began canvassing the neighborhood, knocking on doors and asking for any information about the truck or the suspect. Patrol officers were stationed at key intersections. Flyers with Amber's photo were quickly distributed. Her name, once only known within the family and school circles, became the center of every conversation in Arlington. The description of the suspect was limited. Kevel could only provide basic details: a white or Hispanic male, possibly in his 20s or 30s, driving a black or dark-colored pickup truck with a short bed. The ambiguity of the details posed a challenge. The vehicle could be any number of makes or models. Thousands of similar trucks roamed North Texas roads daily. Despite the limited information, authorities proceeded with urgency. Media outlets picked up the story by the evening. Local TV stations interrupted broadcasts to air bulletins about the missing girl. Amber's photo, a school portrait, was shown with the plea for anyone with information to come forward. Anonymous tip lines were established. Leads began to trickle in, but none led to the suspect or the vehicle. Within 24 hours, the FBI joined the investigation. Their resources allowed for more expansive searches and coordination. Canvases expanded to neighboring towns. Helicopters searched from above. Officers rode on horseback through open fields. K-9 units scoured creeks and wooded areas. But Amber was gone. At the scene, investigators found little forensic evidence. The lot was open, exposed to the elements and foot traffic. No tire marks were distinguishable. No fingerprints were found on the bicycle. The abduction had taken place in the open, but the perpetrator left no trace behind. The case was entered into national databases. Detectives considered all possibilities, including known sex offenders in the area. Interviews were conducted. Backgrounds were checked. Every lead was followed. Still, the truck and the man inside it remained unidentified. In those first crucial hours, the silence surrounding Amber's disappearance deepened. The community waited. Police worked without rest. The family pleaded. But the daylight that had borne witness to the crime gave way to darkness, and Amber had not been found. As Saturday evening faded into night, Amber Hagerman's disappearance ignited a citywide search effort. Law enforcement and volunteers mobilized quickly, each hour deepening the urgency. The possibility that Amber had been taken by a stranger cast a chilling shadow over Arlington, a place where abductions were rare and children still played outside without fear. The command center for the search was established near the site of the abduction. Officers worked in shifts, coordinating with the FBI and other agencies. Maps of the area were marked with grids as teams spread out to search vacant lots, alleyways, parks, and creek beds. Law enforcement expanded their reach beyond Arlington, alerting departments across Texas to be on the lookout for the black pickup truck described by the lone witness. At the same time, residents of Arlington responded with compassion and determination. Volunteers gathered in the dozens, then hundreds, bringing flashlights, warm clothes, and a desire to help in any way they could. Local businesses donated food and supplies to support the searchers. Flyers with Amber's photo and details of the abduction were handed out at intersections and posted on storefront windows, bulletin boards, and utility poles. Television coverage amplified the story. Amber's face appeared on every news broadcast. Her smiling school photo, a painful reminder of the child now missing. Donna Whitson and her family made tearful public appeals, urging the abductor to release Amber safely. Her father, Richard Hagerman, who lived out of town, rushed back to Arlington and joined the efforts. He also made public statements, imploring for his daughter's return. Tips began pouring in. Call centers were overwhelmed with people claiming to have seen a similar truck or suspicious activity. Detectives logged each report, prioritizing those that seemed credible. Yet despite the volume, no lead broke the case open. The vehicle remained unseen since the day of the abduction. No one could identify the man who had taken Amber. While police worked relentlessly, concern turned to fear among residents. Parents kept their children indoors. Neighborhood watch groups sprang up overnight. Local schools addressed the incident with students and staff, urging caution and vigilance. The community, previously tight-knit and trusting, was now unsettled, shaken by the vulnerability exposed by Amber's abduction. In the days that followed, search efforts expanded to include water-based recovery teams. A creek running through Arlington, near the area where Amber was last seen, became a focal point. Divers entered the murky waters, checking for any trace of the girl. Nothing surfaced. Cadaver dogs were brought in to detect signs of human remains, but no scent was found. Amber's family stayed in close contact with investigators, receiving regular updates but no answers. Authorities assured them that every resource was being used, that no angle was being ignored. Despite the intensity of the search, progress was slow. The case had no obvious suspect, no forensic evidence, and only a single eyewitness. Media coverage remained constant. Radio stations repeated Amber's description throughout the day. Newspapers featured updates on the front page. The city's hope remained alive, bolstered by the belief that such a brazen crime committed in daylight might eventually yield a clue or confession. In the meantime, the pink bicycle remained in police custody, Amber's last known possession, taken as evidence but also as a symbol. It was a child's bike, ordinary and worn, left in a place where joy had turned into loss. Investigators revisited the site multiple times, each hoping a missed detail might appear. But the trail had gone cold almost immediately. The days following the abduction turned into a blur of long nights and mounting frustration. Searchers continued their efforts, unwilling to give up. Community vigils were held, prayer circles formed, candlelight ceremonies illuminated parks and churches. Everyone held out hope that Amber would come home. But as day 5 arrived, the mood began to shift. Leads slowed, resources stretched thinner. The initial storm of activity started to settle into a quieter, grimmer reality. Amber was still missing, and her fate remained unknown. 4 days after Amber Hagerman vanished, hope was waning. The city remained gripped by the search, but the mood had shifted from frantic determination to a heavy, silent dread. Each day brought new tips, new interviews, new searches, and each one ended without the answer that everyone desperately wanted. Then, on the afternoon of January 17th, 1996, the call came in. A man walking his dog in a remote area behind the Forest Hollow apartments, near the northwest corner of Arlington, noticed something unusual in the shallow, rain-swollen creek. The area was overgrown with brush and trees, obscuring visibility from nearby roads. As he moved closer, the man made a horrifying discovery: a small body floating in the water. Police were dispatched immediately. When officers arrived, they found the body of a young girl, partially submerged and caught on debris in the creek bed. Her clothing had been removed except for one sock, and her lifeless form bore the marks of a violent end. The location was less than 5 miles from where she had been abducted, hidden by terrain and vegetation that had shielded it from view during earlier search efforts. Amber Hagerman was identified quickly. Her family was notified, and the public was informed soon after. The news sent a wave of grief through Arlington and beyond. The little girl whose image had been on every TV screen, flyer, and street corner was gone. A city's worst fears had been confirmed. Medical examiners conducted an autopsy that night. The preliminary findings revealed that Amber had been kept alive for at least 2 days after her abduction. She had been sexually assaulted. Her throat had been slit. The exact time of death was difficult to determine, but it was likely that she had been killed sometime between January 15th and the early hours of January 17th. The creek had risen due to recent rain, possibly dislodging her body from a more hidden spot upstream and bringing it into view. These details, grim and sobering, gave investigators their first hard facts. The confirmation of the assault suggested a motive. The timeline narrowed the window of opportunity, indicating that the abductor had likely stayed local for at least 2 days. But even with these revelations, the case offered no direct trail to the killer. No physical evidence was found near the body that could lead to a suspect. No witnesses had seen anyone in the area. The discovery of the body led to a second wave of investigative activity. Detectives recanvassed the area around the creek. Door-to-door questioning resumed in nearby apartment complexes. Trash bins, dumpsters, and outbuildings were searched. Crime scene analysts combed the site for any trace evidence, fibers, footprints, anything. But again, the area yielded little. The creek had washed away what little might have been left behind. For Amber's family, the news was devastating. Publicly, her parents expressed gratitude for the community's efforts and asked for privacy to mourn their daughter. Privately, they began the unimaginable process of preparing for her funeral. Vigils that had been held in hope now turned to memorials. The story made national headlines. The brutality of the crime, coupled with the abduction in broad daylight and the failed efforts to save her, resonated deeply. Networks across the country featured the case. Calls for justice echoed from local officials to federal leaders. Law enforcement redoubled their efforts. The FBI provided behavioral analysts to construct a profile of the likely perpetrator. Based on the facts known, they theorized that the suspect was likely male, familiar with the area, and possibly known in the community. The person would have had a vehicle matching the description and a private place to hold Amber for at least 2 days. Still, these were only educated guesses. No name, no suspect emerged. Public frustration mounted. The community had acted swiftly, law enforcement had mobilized rapidly, but the killer had slipped away. The randomness of the act, the sudden abduction, the short distance of the body dump site, the lack of physical evidence, underscored how quickly and quietly a child could be taken and lost. As January drew to a close, the search for Amber shifted into a new phase. No longer was it about finding a missing child. Now it was about finding a killer. The shock of her death settled over Arlington like a fog. Though the search had ended, the need for answers had only begun. In the days following the discovery of Amber Hagerman's body, the Arlington Police Department faced the grim task of turning grief into action. The investigation intensified, but every new direction seemed to close almost as soon as it opened. Despite the involvement of federal agencies and the emotional commitment of the community, progress slowed. The reality of a murder without a suspect began to take hold. Detectives began by re-examining the eyewitness account given by Jim Kevill. His description of the black pickup truck remained the central piece of the investigation. Kevill, though elderly, was alert and coherent. He had seen Amber taken and provided the only known account of the abduction. But the limitations of memory under stress and distance left investigators with a vague vehicle description and a general profile of the suspect. No plate number, no unique markings, and no distinguishing features could be confirmed. The suspect was believed to be a white or Hispanic male, possibly in his 20s or 30s, driving a full-size black or dark-colored pickup with a short bed and single cab. That description matched thousands of trucks in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Police received hundreds of tips. Each was logged, checked, and cross-referenced with vehicle registrations. Several trucks were impounded for inspection, but none proved to be the right one. Meanwhile, the investigative team reviewed the crime scene again. The creek bed where Amber's body was found yielded no trace evidence. The rising water had washed away potential clues. Forensics offered few leads. DNA samples taken from Amber's body were analyzed, but in 1996, the technology was limited. A profile was developed but yielded no match in criminal databases at the time. Authorities interviewed registered sex offenders in the area. More than 80 individuals were contacted and questioned. Some were cooperative, others evasive. Backgrounds were reviewed, alibis confirmed or disproven. Yet none connected definitively to Amber's case. The randomness of the abduction complicated matters. This was not a family member, a neighbor, or a known associate. It appeared to be a crime of opportunity, executed quickly and cleanly, with almost no physical trail left behind. At the same time, police were flooded with false leads. People eager to help submitted sightings, theories, and names. Some claimed to have overheard conversations at truck stops or fast food restaurants. Others provided names of people with criminal histories and access to similar vehicles. Detectives followed each one, knowing that any detail could be the one that broke the case. But none did. Composite sketches were attempted based on vague descriptions, but without more witnesses, they were speculative at best. Flyers with the sketches were distributed widely, posted in post offices, gas stations, and community centers. Still, no solid information came in. The FBI's Behavioral Profiling Unit offered insight into the possible psychological makeup of the suspect. They theorized that the killer may have known the area well, possibly having scouted the location before. The choice of an abandoned parking lot in daylight suggested a degree of boldness or desperation. The abduction was swift, the vehicle was nondescript, and the victim was young and vulnerable. This pointed to a predator, organized enough to act quickly but cautious enough to avoid being seen again. Despite these assessments, the suspect remained unknown. No additional witnesses came forward. No camera footage existed. Surveillance in 1996 was not what it is today. Businesses in the area had no operating security systems. No traffic cameras caught the truck's departure. The case remained shrouded in a fog of unanswered questions. Weeks turned to months. Amber's story stayed in the headlines, but the intensity of coverage began to wane. The case remained open, active, and high priority, but leads dried up. For detectives, it was frustrating. They had an abducted child, an eyewitness, a clear timeline, and still no suspect. Theories emerged. Some investigators believed the killer had left the area. Others thought he was still nearby, hiding in plain sight. Occasionally, tips would reignite hope, sending officers to new locations, questioning new individuals. But each one eventually ended the same way, with no resolution. Amber's parents, now coping with the permanence of her loss, remained vocal. They continued to speak to the media, urging anyone with information to come forward. They attended community meetings and supported new efforts to improve child safety. But justice for Amber remained elusive. As 1996 ended, the case file grew thicker, but the answers remained few. The man who took Amber had disappeared without a trace, and law enforcement, despite exhaustive efforts, had reached a wall. It was not a lack of will or resources. It was a crime carried out with chilling precision, leaving only sorrow in its wake. In the aftermath of Amber Hagerman's murder, her family, still reeling from grief, found themselves at the center of a broader public outcry. The community's sorrow was deep, but it quickly gave way to determination. People asked how such a tragedy could happen in the open, how a child could vanish in seconds and leave no trail. Among the most urgent questions was why no immediate notification had gone out to the public, warning them about the abduction in real time. Amber's case was not the first child abduction in Texas, but its circumstances, daylight, an eyewitness, and the lack of any early alert system brought the issue into sharp focus. Discussions began almost immediately about the need for a rapid response system, one that could quickly notify the public when a child was taken. In the months following Amber's death, local law enforcement, broadcasters, and child advocacy groups began working together to create a solution. The goal was simple but ambitious: to build a system that would broadcast urgent bulletins whenever a confirmed child abduction occurred, using every available channel, radio, television, highway signs, to reach as many people as possible, as fast as possible. What emerged was the Amber Alert System, named in honor of Amber Hagerman, though originally called AMBER for America's Missing Broadcast Emergency Response. It was her name and her case that gave the system its urgency and public resonance. The program was designed to be used in specific circumstances when law enforcement confirmed that a child had been abducted, that the child was at risk of serious harm or death, and when sufficient information about the suspect or vehicle was available to issue an alert. The first Amber Alert was issued in the Dallas-Fort Worth area in 1997. It relied on partnerships between police departments and broadcasters, who agreed to interrupt regular programming to spread the word. Over time, the program expanded to include electronic highway signs, email alerts, and eventually, text messages and push notifications. Amber's family became strong advocates for the system. Her mother, Donna, worked tirelessly with lawmakers and agencies to promote its adoption. She appeared at public events, legislative hearings, and media interviews to share Amber's story and underscore the importance of fast action in abduction cases. Her advocacy helped ensure that what happened to Amber would not be forgotten, and that other children might be saved through the system that now bore her name. Within a few years, the Amber Alert program spread beyond Texas. Other states adopted the system, adjusting it to local needs while following the core principles. In 2003, the program received national recognition when the federal government began supporting it through the PROTECT Act. The Department of Justice took on a coordinating role, helping states streamline their alert systems and ensuring compatibility across borders. The system's success was measured in lives saved. Dozens, then hundreds of children were recovered safely as a result of Amber Alerts. While not every alert led to a rescue, the visibility and awareness they generated proved invaluable. Drivers spotted suspect vehicles. Passers-by recognized abductors, and criminals who once counted on the public's ignorance now faced immediate exposure. Still, the Amber Alert system was not without its critics. Some questioned the criteria, arguing that alerts were issued too selectively, or at times, too broadly. Others pointed to instances where the alerts came too late. Yet overall, the program was widely embraced, seen as a powerful tool in the fight against child abduction. In Arlington and across Texas, Amber's memory endured not just through the system named for her, but in the sense of collective vigilance it fostered. Schools implemented stricter safety protocols. Parents became more cautious. Law enforcement agencies improved coordination. For the Hagerman family, the creation of the Amber Alert system brought a measure of solace, though not closure. It was a way to turn a senseless loss into something meaningful, a public defense against the kind of predator who had taken Amber. Her story had sparked a nationwide reform, one that aimed to ensure that no child could ever be abducted in silence again. Years passed, but the image of Amber Hagerman, her smile, her pink bicycle, her abrupt disappearance, never faded from public memory. Though the Amber Alert system had become a vital tool across the nation, the central question remained unanswered. Who had taken Amber and why? The investigation into Amber's murder remained open, but as time moved on, it entered the realm of cold cases. Detectives rotated in and out of the unit. New technologies were applied. Tips still came in, though less frequently. Each one was evaluated carefully, but none brought investigators closer to identifying the man who had abducted and killed a 9-year-old girl in broad daylight. The original eyewitness account continued to serve as the backbone of the case. Jim Kevil's description of the black pickup truck and the suspect's rapid movements gave police the framework they used from day one. Still, the absence of more concrete identifiers, no plate number, no distinct vehicle markings, no surveillance footage, remained a hurdle. Without that, the man could have been anyone. Over the years, the case files grew thicker. Every tip, every lead, every person of interest added another layer to the investigation. Detectives reviewed them repeatedly. The creek site where Amber's body was found was also reconsidered. Could the suspect have had a connection to that specific area? Had someone in the nearby apartment complex seen something but been too afraid to speak up? Investigators revisited old leads with fresh eyes. In the early 2000s, as DNA analysis improved, the evidence collected from Amber's autopsy was resubmitted for testing. A partial male DNA profile had been obtained, but remained unmatched in any database. No hits were found in CODIS. The absence of a match suggested the suspect had no known criminal record, or had never been arrested for a crime that required DNA collection. Public pressure remained steady. Local news stations continued to cover the case during anniversaries. Amber's family, especially her mother, stayed visible, attending events and appealing to the public for information. Donna often said that someone out there knew the truth. Someone had seen something or heard something, and simply hadn't come forward yet. Over time, different theories emerged. Some believed Amber was abducted by a stranger who had specifically targeted her after watching children ride their bikes. Others suspected the crime might have been opportunistic, committed by someone passing through. Still others held on to the belief that the perpetrator might have been a local, hiding in plain sight for decades. The psychological profile developed by federal experts suggested that the killer likely knew the area and had experience avoiding detection. The speed of the abduction and the absence of evidence supported that theory. The idea that he had watched the parking lot and waited for a moment when a child was alone added to the belief that this was premeditated. Despite technological advances and ongoing investigations, the case remained unsolved. In the late 2010s and into the 2020s, Arlington police reopened the case files for review multiple times. They digitized old evidence, consulted outside experts, and used new software to analyze patterns and possible links to other crimes. Still, no definitive suspect emerged. The emotional weight of the case never lifted. For the detectives involved, Amber's story remained personal. Some carried her photo in their offices or vehicles. Others kept pieces of the case file at hand, unwilling to give up even after years of silence. Amber's family continued to speak publicly about their desire for justice. They reminded the community that the killer was still out there, that time did not erase responsibility. They asked that anyone with even the smallest piece of information, something they might have thought irrelevant or long forgotten, step forward. The unanswered questions haunted everyone involved. Who was the man in the truck? Where had he taken Amber in the 2 days before her death? Why had he chosen that location to leave her body? Did he ever speak of his crime? Did someone, somewhere, suspect the truth but choose silence? More than 2 decades after the crime, the outline of what happened was clear. The identity of who did it remained obscured. And though Amber's name had become synonymous with a nationwide alert system, the one case the system had not been able to solve was hers. Amber Hagerman's story did not end with the identification of a suspect or a courtroom verdict. Her legacy, shaped by tragedy, instead became a catalyst for lasting change. Though her killer remained unidentified, the impact of her short life and violent death continued to ripple outward through communities, law enforcement systems, and national child protection policies. The most tangible legacy was the Amber Alert system. Born directly from the public's response to Amber's abduction, it evolved into a critical tool for law enforcement. By the mid-2000s, the system had become national, coordinated through the U.S. Department of Justice and adopted in every state. Amber Alerts now appeared on highway signs, cell phones, radio, television, and even social media, often within minutes of a confirmed abduction. The system had a measurable effect. Children who might have vanished without a trace were instead found quickly, sometimes within hours, because the public was alerted in time to intervene or provide crucial tips. Law enforcement credited the program with saving hundreds of lives. Each successful recovery served as a reminder of what was lost in 1996 and what had since been built in Amber's memory. The Amber Alert became a model for similar systems internationally. Countries such as Canada, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Australia developed their own versions, often citing Amber Hagerman's case as a key influence. Her story had crossed borders, becoming a symbol of both vulnerability and the urgent need for coordinated action. Back in Arlington, Amber's name was not forgotten. A park was dedicated in her honor, Amber Hagerman Memorial Park, where children now played, laughed, and ran freely, surrounded by reminders of a community that had once gathered in grief. School children who passed through the park learned her name, even if they had not been born when she died. Her image remained in the minds of teachers, parents, and officers who remembered the girl with the pink bike. Her family continued to speak at public events, particularly those focused on child safety and victim advocacy. Amber's mother, Donna, became a voice for families of missing children, offering support to others who had suffered similar losses. Through speeches, interviews, and advocacy, she helped keep attention on both unresolved cases and the broader fight to prevent child abductions. The case also influenced local law enforcement procedures. Agencies across Texas and the U.S. reviewed how they responded to missing children reports. New protocols emphasized immediate action, faster communication between jurisdictions, and better engagement with media outlets. The delay that might have cost Amber her life became a cautionary tale, one that shaped response strategies moving forward. Beyond systems and procedures, Amber's story also changed the way communities viewed their collective role in protecting children. Neighbors, once distant, began to look out for each other's families more closely. Parents became more cautious, teaching their children about safety and awareness at earlier ages. Schools included safety education in their curricula. Community watch programs expanded. Still, even with all the change her death had inspired, the core pain of the case remained. The man who abducted and murdered her had never been caught. The investigation stayed active, with police reminding the public at regular intervals that justice had not been served. On anniversaries, local news would revisit the story, urging viewers to come forward with any memory, any suspicion, any detail that might help. For many, Amber came to represent both the terrifying randomness of child abduction and the power of community response. Her loss was a wound, but her name became a rallying point, a reason to act faster, coordinate better, and never ignore a missing child report. Her legacy was not only in the alerts that bore her name, but in the children who returned home because of them.